The wind off the Ironman's Bay came like a long memory, cold on the teeth and tasting of brine and old wars. Theon Greyjoy stood at the lip of the causeway where the spray broke white against the black rocks, and looked up at Pike with its torn sky and its rope bridges thrumming like harp strings. His cloak snapped behind him, wetted and heavy, and the whole place smelt as it had in his boyhood. Kelp and tar, gulls and the iron stink of wet rust. It was a smell he'd never found south of the neck, and it rose in him now as if to claim him back. Men moved like shadows along the walkways, their lanterns little blurs of gold in the wind. Theon caught the eye of one, a boy he did not know but who bore the look of all iron-born lads, lean as a knife and already thinking of far horizons. The boy turned away. Theon put his hand to the carved kraken on the doorpost of his father's keep and felt the grooves under his fingertips. His palm came away damp with spray. It was not the spray that made his heart quicken. It was the 4 lines written in his head, and the answer they might call forth. 2 men shouldered the doors wide to the hall. The light within was low and red, a hearth's heart and torches smoking in iron brackets. He saw his father at once by the way other men bent around him, even before the fur mantle and the shoulders like quarried stone. Balon Greyjoy's hair had thinned, but the face beneath was the same tower of pride Theon remembered too well. Asha stood at his father's right hand with her easy stance, one hip to the trestle, watching Theon the way she watched the sea, amused and assessing both. Aeron Damfair had his place near the fire, hair and beard alike salted gray and wiry, his eyes bright with a constant inward tide. "You took your time," Balon said, and the hall quieted deeper. "Has the wolf taught you to forget the tide waits on no man?" "The tide still comes in twice a day, father," Theon said lightly, though every rib in him felt bound. "And I have brought it with me." He moved close enough to smell the smoke on Balon's mantle, the salt in his beard. He laid the folded parchment on the table where the lantern light made a thin gold smear on the wax. "Robb Stark sends words and bold promises," Theon said. "He offers you more than empty courtesies. He offers what the Ironborn have not had since Harren the Black crowned himself king on a blasted stone. The sea for our road and the isles for our throne, without oaths to a southern lord. He asks that the Iron Fleet fall upon the Lannister shore and put Lannisport to sack while he strikes by land. He asks for a storm such as men will sing for 100 years. Asha's mouth tilted, and her thumb rode the rim of her cup. Aeron bent slightly, as if to listen to the god whispering out of the flames. Balon did not touch the parchment. He did not look at it. He watched Theon as a maker watches the blade he has quit his hammering upon, as if waiting to see whether it will sing true. "What the wolf offers, he cannot give," Balon said, not looking away. "He is naked crown and river mud, a green boy with antlers more than a crown, and he sends you to make me his shipbuilder. If he were only that, he would not hold the West Riverlands and have Tywin Lannister pacing behind stone like a lion in a pit." Theon answered, hearing for an instant Robb's low voice, the way he said a thing once, and it stayed said. "He is what half the North swore him, and what the River Lords named him, King in the North. He asks you not for fealty, but for alliance. There is salt enough between the two of you to make a sea." Aeron stirred. "What does the green boy promise the drowned god's people?" "Words written on baked clay break when the jar drops. Independence of the Iron Islands," Theon said. "Acknowledgement without strings. Leave to raid the western shores and take what we can hold. Ships, timber, the gold of Lannisport. And this besides, he gives you his word that when the West burns, he will not come after your plunder." Now Asha laughed outright, a sound like bright metal. "By the time the West burns, every fisher in the Mander will be rowing to save a cask of oil. Words are cheap. I can offer father a cheaper promise, that the wind will blow. Menderwinds." Balon's hand made a small motion, and Asha's laughter fell away. He passed a finger along the rim of the parchment at last, but still did not open it. Theon felt anger stir, old as the sea and hot with it. He knew his father's hunger for dignity the way a sailor knows the taste of bilge. He'd come home with something more than trinkets to be weighed and found wanting, and he would not let Balon treat it as a toy. "Father," Theon said, and made himself gentle, "he offers you what Robert Baratheon did not. He asks you to strike the Lannister shore, not our own old stones. You spoke once of the West's softness. Strike them while Lord Tywin is east and the Gold Road lies bare. Take their harbor and burn their fleet in its cradle. Make them weep salt. Ben? Balon at last broke the wax and read. Theon watched the words move in the old man's eyes. He saw something in them flicker like a guttered torch and flare again. Old wrongs have a long memory, Balon said. At Fair Isle the young stag commanded the fleets that broke ours, and we left our dead to the gulls. But in Lannisport, that same year, a Greyjoy ship came by night and sent half the Lannister fleet to the bottom. The lions have never forgotten. I have never forgotten how the rock looked in moonlight when we took what we wanted and got away besides. His mouth had shifted when he spoke of it. A thing like hunger that had nothing to do with food. This wolf boy would have us do it again, and promise us the far shore besides. Would have us, Aeron murmured, as if tasting the words. Would have the gods will bend to a boy's map. Asha's eyes were on Theon. What did the boy king give you to bring this? A gold chain? A wolfhound pup, to sleep at the foot of your feather bed? He gave me nothing I did not take, Theon said. He asked for a friend where he had a hostage. I told him what we most desired, to be left to our seas and our raids, true to ourselves. He heard it. He sent it back in ink. Balon's fist closed on the parchment. For a heartbeat, Theon thought he would dash it into the fire, and almost wished he would, to be done with this gnawing. But Balon turned to Aeron and Asha with the same movement he used at the tiller, and the hall leaned with him. Call Victarion, Balon said, and the men nearest the door ran as if the word were a rush of water. Call the captains. We will not wait for the tide to turn while the lion licks his paws on roast meat. If the wolf would have our oars, he must hear how we set them. Aeron's eyes went bright. I will pray on the strand, he said. I will drown a man and bring him back, that the god might speak. Asha lifted a brow and looked at Theon, as if to say that all this seriousness would founder on some rock they both could see. Victarion came heavy-booted and square-shouldered, his face as grave as an anchor and twice as steadied. He was salt on iron, a quiet that had always made Theon a little boy again, wanting to be seen and not showing he wanted it. He bowed his head to Balon and looked briefly to Theon with no kindness in him. We sail, Balon told him. Then Eastport. Victarion's eyelid twitched. That was all. Theon felt something loosen in his chest like a knot pulled free. He had not known how tightly it had been tied. We will need stealth, Victarion said. Fire ships. A wind that is more favor than faith. His eyes shifted to Asha. And scouts with a quick tongue for landfolk ways. Asha lifted her cup. I have always been quick with my tongue. Victarion, Balon said. Authority suddenly bare and cold. You will take the Iron Fleet to the shadow of Fair Isle and wait for the signal. Asha, you will go south ahead of him, 3 long ships only, and put your feet in Lannisport if you can. See their watch. Count their masts. Find me where their guard sleeps. Penden. His gaze turned last and hardest to Theon. You will ride north to Seaguard and then east to the Twins to meet the wolf. You will wear our promise at your belt and our warning in your mouth. Tell him we will come by night, as the tide comes, without mercy and without delay. Tell him that if we find his own banners in our way, we will push through them to the city. Tell him that once Lannisport's gates are open, he will have the road. And tell him that the Iron Islands bend to no king, even one who knows how to use a friend. He may call me ally and nothing more. Messias. It was more than Theon had hoped, and less than he could admit to hope for in this hall. He bowed the way he had bowed as a boy, and straightened as the man he believed himself to be. I will carry the words, he said, and I will bring the wolf to the shore at the hour you choose. Aeron lifted his staff and struck it on the stone. The sound was a low drum that made the hall's rafters hum. Men were already moving, voices rising. Theon felt the sway of it inside him like a deck under his boots. He stepped back out into the wind because he could not bear to stand still. On the strand, the Damfair's acolytes had a man down. They held him pale and shivering, a rope looped under his arms, and the priest raised the wet driftwood cudgel that was his god's own. The sea reached for all of them, cold as a knife. When the cudgel came down, the sound of it was almost tender. The man's chest rose, sank, rose no more. Only the continual breathing of the sea remained. Aaron's voice lifted above it, not louder, but more focused, as if the words themselves were binding the wind. "What is dead may never die," Aaron cried, "but rises again, harder and stronger." The man came back with a wrenching cough and vomited the sea. Theon had seen this as a boy, and later as Robb Stark's man. He had told himself it was trickery or fervor, or something other men needed because they could not bear to be merely mortal. Now, for a quick, treasonous moment, he wished the water would fill his own chest and wash it clean of everything that hindered him. The thought passed. He turned away and set his face to the north road. The ride to Seaguard rang with lark song when he was near shore, and with the rattle of his own breath when he struck inland to skirt patrols he could not afford to answer for. He kept close to lanes that had grown wild since the war began, and slept once beneath a crabapple tree. The kind of sleep where you wake every hour thinking you have not slept at all. At Seaguard, Lord Mallister received him in a tower that looked over the Bay of Seals like a lookout carved for a giant, and when he saw the kraken pin at Theon's throat, his mouth thinned. But there was a white wolf's head above Theon's heart and a sealed parchment in his hand, heavy with the wax of Lord Balon's seal. That weight did what all Theon's smooth words could not. He left Seaguard under a flag of truce, with 6 riders and a fresh horse, and entered the Twins at noon the following day, where the bridge castles threw their shadow on the green fork like a long bar. In Lord Frey's great hall, he drank wine that tasted as if the press had been trampled by goats, and smiled at Walder Frey's watery eyes for as long as the old man chose to make him. "You went home and came back smelling of fish," the Lord of the Crossing said, as if it were a joke only he understood. "Tell him in the west our bridges stand. Tell him they stand for paying folk." "I will tell him you think yourself a pillar," Theon said brightly, and was glad to be gone. Robb Stark had moved his camp west of the Blue Fork's bend and set a ring of pickets as clean and precise as needlework. Theon knew the wolf before he saw the boy who wore it. Gray wind moved like a rumor at the edge of the wood, and then he was there, a gray shadow that made the hairs on Theon's arms lift. Men watched the wolf pass and looked away because to look too long was to know something about yourself you might not like. Robb rose in the center of the camp with a map across his knees and Catelyn Stark's silence like a second presence behind him. Theon swallowed his eagerness the way one swallows a too-hot drink, quickly, and with bravado, expecting the burn and pretending it does not hurt. He knelt, bowed, stood, and gave the words. When Theon said Lannisport out loud, something passed between the mother and her son that Theon could not read. Catelyn's hands tightened lightly on one another, and Robb set his finger on the drawn line where the coast curled like a sleeping cat. "He will do it," Robb said at last, not to Theon but to the map, as if the paper had asked him a difficult question, and he had decided to answer. "Good. Then we go west at once. Not by the Gold Road but by the Lands Roads, quiet as a fox on snow. Oxcross first, to put Stafford Lannister's new-made host to flight before it thinks itself an army. Then Crag, Ashmark, wherever their pride puts its boots. If the fleet burns their harbor the same night we come up on their walls, the lions will wake to 2 mouths on their throat at once. Then," Catelyn's voice was low and even, "you would put your army between the rock and the sea, and ask the boy you promised to send home to lead the men who might let you out again." Robb looked up at her, and something of the boy Theon had known broke the surface and was gone again, a fish flash. "I would ask my friend to keep faith," he said, "and I would put my trust where I have always put it, on the men who follow me because I do what I say." Theon felt his heart thump because he knew that tone, and because he knew how often men had followed it. He also knew how such men died. He had not expected to feel the pinch of that thought. He turned swiftly and smiled too broadly. "I can make Victarion Greyjoy listen to sense if not to me," he said. "Asha will be there. She listens to herself. It is almost the same thing." Robb's mouth quirked. "I will settle for almost," he said. "You will stay with me for now. When we come within 3 days' ride of Lannisport, I will have you ride southwest with 100 men of mine, to take the shore road and meet the fleet. They may not welcome the sight of a wolf's head in their flank. Your tongue is better than most swords in that work. Ben? Caitlyn's eyes searched Theon's face. The way mothers who have had sons in harm's way search every younger face. Measuring, guessing, fearing. Theon met her gaze with a kind of defiance that felt adolescent in his bones and could not be helped. At last, she looked past him. If the Greyjoys come at all. She murmured. They will, Theon said, surprising himself with the certainty that rose in him. Balon wants the sound of his own name over the water like thunder. He will not let Victarion pass up a chance to redress a bruise he's carried since Fair Isle. And Asha? Asha wants the story. Caitlyn's mouth pressed, but she said no more. Robb's hand dropped to Grey Wind's ruff as the direwolf pushed his head under it as a hound might. The gesture broke the tension like a wave collapsing. Victarion Greyjoy trailed no banners at sea. He slid the Iron Fleet along the coast where cliffs dropped like sundered loaves, and the light on the water went dull and sullen when cloud took it. His long ship's prow had a kraken carved in relief that made the spray splay in little fan blades when they struck a wave. He slept little, and when he did the sea woke him, some shift of the swell or the timbers, as if it kept him for its own. He moved through his ships like a thought through a school of fish, and every oar slowed or sped with him. Asha had gone ahead with her 3 longships and a crew of lean men who smiled when they did not mean it. She beached by night twice, once in a weed-choked cove where the rocks were like black teeth, and once beneath a cliff path that led up to a goat track and a shepherd's bothy that stank of old cheese. In the second place she found a boy and a girl asleep in the loft, a jug of small beer by their heads, and a sack of grain half buried in straw. Asha put her hand over the boy's mouth, lowered him gentle as if she loved him, and then tied both and set her own girl to coax their tongues. She took little but information, a practice she had taught herself with some effort, and now affected as a style. The boy had sat upon the gates of Lannisport and watched the harbor chain. There was a chain. Old stories were stubborn things, rise at dusk and sink with the dawn. He knew which lantern on the liftkeeper's tower foreshadowed a sleepy watchman, and which a zealous one. He knew, because boys see everything that is put under their noses, and much that men hide poorly. Asha sent the shepherds away with a copper each, and the warning that if they told a soul she would come back as a gull, and peck out their eyes in their sleep. The girl laughed. The boy cried. It pleased Asha that she could make both reactions with the same handful of words. On a hill west of Oxcross, the air smelled of crushed thyme and old wool. Robb Stark knelt to fasten a strap on his boot, and looked up. When Grey Wind's head turned, his ears pricked. Theon squat on his heels, the way he'd been taught as a boy when you wait for something to show itself. They are camped on 3 sides of a fallow field, he said, because he had seen 100 such camps, and they were all made of the same habits. Sir Stafford's men will have set the horse on the highest ground, and the levy out by the hedges, closest to the latrines. The firelight says they think themselves safe. They think themselves an army, Robb said, and there was an odd tenderness in it. We will teach them the other thing. The attack came under cover of a fog that rolled down the hill like milk poured from a giant's bowl. The Northmen moved barefoot, their boots tied at their belts, bronzed hooves and shod hooves, alike muffled in the damp. Theon went beside Daisy Mormont, who laughed softly the way a person laughs when hunting, because the space between enemies is always full of something that is almost joy. They cut the picket like threads on a loom, and slipped into the camp's weave. Grey Wind drifted like a piece of the fog that had found hunger, and the first man he pulled down had time to make only a single wet, surprised sound, like a falcon with its throat slit. When the shouting began, it began everywhere at once, because sound travels oddly in fog, and because fear travels true. Theon found himself at a hedge and vaulted it, and landed in a cook fire, sending sparks up like bees. His blade took a man he could not see, without knowing where his throat lay. He grimaced at the blind intimacy of it, and then turned to find Daisy at his elbow, her cheek black with soot, and her hairline beaded with fog. She grinned like a bear's daughter indeed. They moved again and again, and the camp broke in 3 directions, and each of those pieces broke. By dawn the field was a trampled stew of canvas and bodies and spilled oats, and the Northmen were rounding prisoners like sheep with dogs. Robb stood with his hair wet and his eyes very blue. Theon looked at him and thought of the first fox he had ever seen. A little dun thing, and too clever for the trapper who wanted its pelt. He had liked the fox because it did not care who wanted what from it. He disliked Robb in that moment for the same reason, and loved him a little despite it. They moved quickly after Oxcross, because speed was the only currency that buys advantage cheaply. Robb sent riders like flicked pebbles into the hedges and lanes, and followed their ricochet with men who knew how to run quiet. They came on the crag at dusk 2 days later, found its garrison more insult than defense, took its walls by ladders, and were gone before noon the next day. Theon had never much cared for stone that smelled of damp old rushes and lordly lineage. He liked the open road where the possibilities moved with the same wind as his cloak. 3 days from Lannisport, Robb sent Theon southwest with 100 men under Lord Rickard Karstark's second son, a quiet lad who had the same narrow mouth as his father, but not the same bile behind it. They cut west, came on the sea at last where it showed through the gorse in long flashes, and rode along the shore road where dunes puffed in their faces like sighs. The tide was running long. You could feel it in the way the air moved, a pulling. At night on the headland above the city, Theon looked down at Lannisport and thought of a hearth fire seen from the yard when you are not sure the door will open to let you in. The city was a necklace of lights around the curve of the bay, the rock a looming black presence to the north that swallowed the starlight where it rose. The harbor chain lifted dark against the lit water like a piece of men's stubbornness thrown against the sea's indifference. Theon smelled pitch and fish and something sweet, anise maybe, on the night air. He could taste his father's story on his tongue. He could taste the future like blood in a cut mouth. He left the Karstark boy in a grove of scrub pines, with orders to keep the men off any farmer's earth that might lead to torches and questions. He took 5 and went down the goat path that even goats had ceased to use, and met Asha under a leaning wall where a painted saint had been scoured down to her outline by salt. "You look like the dog that caught the duck and found it was a goose," Asha said. "You look like the cat that licked the cream off the butter and left the pat to fool the cook." She laughed. "Victarion is east of Fair Isle," she said, the humor gone at once, business in its place. 2 days out. The wind will bring him. I have 3 men living under the walls with a fishmonger's niece who sneaks them bread for the fun of it. They say the night watch on the lift house is a man who counts down the hours to dawn with a song he learned as a boy, and he is on the last verse when he forgets to look where he should. They say the harbor chain can be unseated if one knows the smell of old grease. They have a man who knows that smell in his bones. Theon felt his mouth dry. And the lion? The garrison is fat with merchants' nephews, and they sleep well, Asha said. Crows in the rock watch the city more than the city watches itself. There will be a signal from the headland when the fleet stands in. A light, then darkness, then 3 lights. Can your wolves see it? My wolves see in other ways, Theon said. But there are men among them with eyes. They stood quiet, listening to the city's breathing. A dog barked somewhere far down in the maze. A woman laughed. The sound came up the hill diluted and softer than it had been, like wine cut with water. Theon looked at Asha's profile and thought how little of their childhoods could be fit into any room together, how much of it had been wind and spray and the backs of men. "Do you ever think of what comes after?" he asked before he knew he meant to speak. "Beyond the plunder, beyond the song they might sing. When the sun comes up on a shore we have burned." She turned her head with a little frown, not unkindly, as if he had asked whether the sea wept. "The song is what comes after," she said. "The sun comes up whether we burn or not. We choose whether our names go east with it on men's lips." Dain. He might have said more, but the wind lifted, and he turned to it the way men do when they know a change of weather as intimately as a change of mood in a friend. He heard it before he saw it, the long sigh of many oars pulling together, the occasional creak of iron in wood, a murmurous traveling sound that could be mistaken for the sea's own voice until your ear learned the word within it. Long ships slid into the night like dark thoughts. Theon felt his stomach drop as if he had stepped down onto a stair that was not there and caught himself somehow. Asha's face had gone very still. 3 lights blinked and vanished and blinked again at the edge of the headland. The harbor chain's lift house stood a little more brightly than the lamps about it, as if the keeper took his pride in making it so. Theon put his hand on Asha's shoulder and did not know he had done so until she did not shake it off. "Give me your quiet men," she said, "and send your wolves to the north gate. When the fire ships break, when the chain falls, the harbor will be a mouth, not a wall. The lions will run to stamp out the fire. They always do. That is when your boy king will put his hand on their gate and push." And he went back to the grove with the scrub pines whispering like conspirators. He sent 10 men to Asha, the lightest-footed and most calm-eyed, men who could tie knots and untie themselves from panic. He sent a runner flitting under darkness to Karstark's lad with the single word: "Ready." He sat with his back to a tree and made himself breathe as if this were a thing he had done twice a week for 10 years. His hands were very still in his lap. His heart was not. In the harbor, 2 drab hulks detached themselves from the arm of the outer mole. They had been riding at anchor all day and no one had wondered about them. Merchants came and went. The docks were a daily liturgy. Now they moved, almost shyly, and drifted until they were slow against the chain. A shape rose where the chain met iron. A man's bent back, hands like tools. A light blinked once, twice from the lift house. A sleepy little thing. The chain gave a little shudder and lay down in the water like a creature that has decided to sleep. Someone shouted, but by the time the shouting found words, the drab ships had been kissed with flame. They blossomed in the second heartbeat, like fields of broom in summer. Fire made a language the sea recognized, and the sea carried it in 2 directions at once. Victarion's longships came in like knives tossed by a juggler who has practiced all his life and knows when each blade will turn in the air. They slid under the chain's sinking belly and softened the splash with their oars, and then they were among the first moorings. Ironborn men went over the sides like beads shaken off a broken necklace. They moved where rope made ladders and pilings made steps. Asha's 3 shadows took the lift house with a soft crack, and the sound of a man's breath leaving him. And then a green light hung for a blink from the balcony rail and fell into the dark. On the hill, Theon rose. Karstark's boy did not shout. He only put his hand out, and men stood as if pulled up by a string, and moved. They went down the goat path like the water that follows a stream after rain. The gate at the city's landward side was a thing of respectable thickness and guards, with shoulders cocked in habitual boredom. The first arrow took a man above his gorget, and the second in the face. Before the third arrow flew, 2 men had their hands on the winch and were dead for it. Before the fourth, the winch was turning. The gate's bar came up with a groan and complained all the way to its seat. There were bells. There are always bells. Listen to enough bells in enough towns, and you will know how different they are, how each one makes its own shape of fear. Lannisports were confident bells that had rung for trade in weddings and lordly entries. Panic suited them poorly. They clanged with a voice that said, "This is an unfortunate accident," nothing more. Men ran for buckets, and then ran for swords, and Theon thought, watching them, how often men mistake the order of those things. The first of the longships nosed into a berth like an animal that has found its pen open and expects to be beaten for it. The Ironborn came off them the way winter comes off the sea, in a sudden squall that leaves glass full of salt somehow, though the windows were shut. Victarion's voice was the sea made human, low and relentless. Asha's was the wave that slips under a cliff and carves at its foot when no one watches. Fires climbed rigging, ran along tar seams, found barrels, found cloth, found the stacks of oiled ropes that always mark a harbor. Sailors fell in and came up burning. The water took them and made their flames hiss and cling. Smoke went up quick as a hex, full of sparks, and bent in the wind and went sideways into the city. Theon crossed the threshold into Lannisport and was caught for a moment by a small, absurd detail. The way a woman in a green shawl bent to scoop up a child who had dropped a carved wooden whale and would not leave it. Theon saw the boy's mouth open. He could not hear the sound the boy made and was grateful for that. He kept moving because he did not know what else to do. A knot of Lannister men-at-arms tried to form in a street where the cobbles had been polished by 1,000 carts. Karstark's lad took them in the side, and Dacy Mormont came in with him, and between them they made a hole and walked through it. Theon found he was smiling. It felt more like a baring of teeth. The smell in that street was hot tallow and crushed oranges. At the harbor mouth, one of Asha's men had found the winch that moved the chain and thrown its gears until they screamed. The chain lay in the water like a great dead eel. He stuck a wedge with a hammer blow to keep the thing from rising again and spat on his hands, and laughed, because he had done work he admired. A crossbow bolt took him in the mouth and his laugh ended with an ugly wetness. Asha saw it and flinched, and did not stop. Night felt shorter than it was. Fighting makes night and day into odd, unequal things, where a minute can be an hour and an hour can be a finger snap. Theon came to the square with the guild hall, and found the doors barred, and the windows shuttered, and thought how an honest merchant's guild learns too quickly to hide like a lordling's daughter. He tossed a torch up onto the shutters to find the seam, and a man inside screamed, not in pain but in indignation, which made Theon think he must have been a guildmaster. He moved on, and did not wait to see whether the guildhouse would burn. He told himself later he had no time, though the truth was that a part of him did not want to watch 1,000 measures of purple-dyed wool go up. That kind of waste offended him even when war did not. They reached the inner quay where the Lannister banner hung limp in smoke and heat, and there, at last, Theon saw the boy he had come down out of night to lace their cunning to. Robb Stark stood with his cloak thrown back and grey wind at his side, and his men fanning around him as heat fans a fire. Theon felt something like relief, something like regret, something sharper than either. Robb's face had ash on it, and a cut along the cheekbone that would scar if he did not lose the cheek to some worse thing later. He saw Theon and lifted his hand. It was as if he had lifted the moon. "Your father keeps his word," Robb said, and Theon could not tell whether he meant it as praise or as an accusation. "My father keeps his own counsel," Theon said, which answered neither. Grey wind slid past Theon without a glance, drawn by a boy running with a brand who did not see the shadow until it took him in the back of the knee. The boy made a sound like a hinge a man has forgotten to oil and went down. Theon looked away not because the sight did not please him like a soldier, but because it pleased him too much. He had made a bargain with himself long ago about what he would enjoy, and he was suddenly unsure which side of the bargain he kept. Victarion came out of smoke with his beard singed, and his eyes steady as if the fire were an old friend who had overstepped, but would be forgiven. He took in Robb and the direwolf with a measuring glance, and inclined his head half a finger's breadth. It was as deep a courtesy as Victarion gave any man who did not share his blood. "The chain fell too easy," he said to Theon. "They have rebuilt in the west, but their hands have grown soft at old tasks." Robb heard the curt statement and took it for what it was, a report, not an invitation. "How long before the Rock's garrison pours down the road?" he asked. "How long before the lion's paw swipes at our backs?" Victarion's mouth moved in something like a smile, and was not. "A lion does not like to get his fur wet," he said. "If he comes, he will come along the high walks. If he stays, he will stay where he can look down and remind himself he is large. We have an hour before dawn, and at dawn the city will wake to itself. We take what we came for, or we leave." "Then, what did we come for?" Asha called, appearing as if the smoke had decided to give her up. Her hair was stuck to her forehead, and her mouth had a cut at one corner that made every smile look like a sneer. "Did the wolf come for the same thing as the kraken? Or are we both only hungry dogs who found the same stew?" Robb looked from one to the other, and Theon admired him for not flinching. "I came to cut a purse that has fed a war," he said. "To take Lannister levies in chains rather than kill them, if I may. To make this city so dear to Lord Tywin that he turns east with all his strength, leaving the Riverlands loose in their bonds. If I can do it without burning half the small folk out of their beds, I will." Asha's eyelid flickered, just enough to show that his answer had not been what she expected. She inclined her head the way men do before they kill each other, and such gestures still have use. "I came for ships and gold and stories," she said. "We can each have a portion. The night is not a loaf that must be cut in equal slices, but there is bread enough." "Nam?" They moved then, as if the city were a game board too simple for so many players to complicate. Theon saw how Robb's men set a cordon around the tax house and the mint. Lannisport would mint its coin under the Rock's leave and the guild's pressure. And coin is the nerve that makes a lord's hand close or open. He saw how Victarion sent men straight to the shipyards to light them. Fire on new timbers teaches a lesson long remembered. He saw how Asha split her crews to the warehouses where pepper and silk and wool sat in quiet, waiting to be traded in daylight. Those things burned too, and made a smell richer than a lord's banquet, and as sickening to any man who had known hunger. He saw Daisy Mormont take a badge from a dead Lannister guard and nail it to a post with her knife and grin. By dawn the smoke lay on the city like a low roof. Men coughed black. The bells had lost their confidence and clanged now like pots banged in a kitchen when a child plays at riot. Theon stood on the quay and watched as a line of men in red cloaks tried to make a stand at the foot of a stair that led up to an arch where lions had been carved 500 years ago by men with patient hands. The red cloaks held, wavered, fell, rose, fell. He could not tell which men wore fear, and which duty, and which both. His own heart did not know whether to be glad or tired. Somewhere west of the city a horn blew, long and low. Victarion's head turned to it the way a hound turns to a whistle he knows. Asha swore softly, not in fear but in annoyance. "The lion shakes himself," she said. Robb's jaw tightened. "We are done," he said, as if choosing to be done were nobility rather than necessity. "Take what we have gathered, not one cart more. Break what cannot be carried away that would serve them. Then we go north with our prisoners and our proof." "Proof?" Asha asked sharply. Robb gestured to the quay, where a nobleman sat on a crate, with his hands bound and a look of affronted incredulity fixed, like an ornament to his face. "Proof that Lord Tywin's hand is not long enough to reach all his children at once," he said. Asha's eyes crinkled. "I will take my proof in gold weight and iron chains," she said. "But we will agree to call both proof." They withdrew more neatly than such fights usually allow, because Victarion's longships lay with their oars kissed by smoke, and their prows pointed home like hounds held on leash. The northern men did not look as comfortable on those decks as the Ironborn did, but they stood steady, and they watched the shore as it slid back with the wary distrust of men who do not like to turn their backs on a thing that has teeth. Theon watched Lannisport grow small, and thought of how men's greatest accomplishments and worst crimes look equally manageable at a sufficient distance. On the deck of Victarion's flagship, Balon's brother stood like a piece of the ship itself. He turned as Theon came in and looked at him. He had not liked Theon as a boy, and had found no reason to adjust that opinion. Theon met his eyes and said nothing of childhood at all. "You will tell your father," Victarion said, "that the wolves kept their feet on the planks and did not vomit like green boys." "I will tell him the truth," Theon said. "And I will tell the wolf that you took your fires neat and your ropes clean." Victarion made an approving sound that might have been a chuckle in an easier man. At noon the tide turned and the longships rode it like men taking steps in a dance they knew by heart. Asha sprawled on the forward beam of her own command, hair blown wild and eyes alive, and sometimes shouted something scathing at a cousin or an enemy or both. Theon stood with one hand on the rail and felt the run of the sea in his bones such that for a little while the war quieted. It was like sitting in a room with a friend who does not speak and needs not. The Northmen spoke in low voices, counting prisoners and weighing what carts had been pushed into the sea, rather than leave them full. Karstark's boy rode on a scrap with a bit of scorched charcoal and folded it neat when it was done. "For Lord Robb," he said, with the kind of gravity young men give any act if they do not yet know how strange half their acts are. In the evening the coast fell behind, and the sea lay around them, like all the other seas men tell lies about to each other in taverns. Theon thought of Robb's face in the firelight, and of Catelyn's eyes, of Asha's laugh, and Victarion's silence, of Balon's hard profile. He thought of the boy at the shepherd's loft, and the wooden whale he had not seen again. He tried to count the gains. He tried not to count the losses. He told himself that this was the making of something new, and that making is always messy. He did not wholly persuade himself. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister woke to a raven whose beak clattered on his window like an accountant's pen tapping a ledger. He untied the message, broke the seal, and read with an odd sensation that combined nausea and admiration. He sat long with the paper in his hand, and then rose, and went to find Varys, who always knew before you did but feigned delight. in discovering. "We have been robbed while asleep," Tyrion said. "Not only of goods but of our sense that we sleep behind doors. It seems the Greyjoys have found boats again and remembered how to put men in them. And the boy Wolf has found courage in the dark." Varys made a face of mild distress. "Dear me," he murmured. "The small folk will be afraid. Fear is not good for trade." "Then?" "Now." Tyrion gave him the kind of smile that used to make Shay laugh, because it showed his teeth without showing any joy. "Nor good for kings," he said. "Send to my sister. Send to my father. Send to anyone who prefers to read bad news on a page rather than in flame." He looked out the window. The city was waking into heat. For a quick, odd instant, he wished he could smell the smoke that still hung heavy over Lannisport. He did not know whether it was a professional interest, or a perverse curiosity, or some part of him that liked to see the proud scalded. He decided it did not matter. He had work, and work is a good stone to put between yourself and your feelings. At Harrenhal, Lord Tywin Lannister stood in a room with a window set deep in the oldest stone men had bothered to name. The black walls seemed to drink the light. He read, and he did not move as he read, and his face did not change shape. The man who had brought the letter wished that it would ignite spontaneously and save him the task of asking any question. It did not, and so Tywin turned the page easily, as if he were reading of an expected dinner guest, dietary peculiarities. "Lannisport," Tywin said at last, pronouncing each syllable with clemency and then withdrawing it. "I wonder whether it pleases our enemy that I am old enough to have been pleasured by this prank before." He folded the parchment as if folding a sleeve. "Send for Sir Adam," he said. "Send for every man with a horse whose belly is not distended by beer. We ride west." The man bowed low enough to show the bald spot at the crown of his head. "My lord," he said, as if to apologize for both the news and his hair. Tywin stood alone and looked at the map on the table. He moved one small iron lion one square. It made the slight rasp of iron on old wood. He placed one finger on the riverlands and one on the west, and pressed until the skin under his nails went white. Then he released both pressure and thought, and went to put his belt on. Decisions are easier when you are moving. The difficulty lies in the stopping. Back on the sea, Theon slept badly and dreamed like a boy fevered. In his dream, he was a child again in Pike's Hall, and his father's arm was around his shoulders with a weight that might have been love if it had not been so heavy. Robb came in wearing a wet cloak and shook himself like a wolf, and water flew everywhere. Asha sat on the table with her legs swinging and laughed like gulls. Victarion looked at them all and said nothing, and fixed a rope that had come undone, and Theon felt both grateful and ashamed. The dream turned, and the hall went away, and he stood on the quay at Lannisport, watching a boy look for a wooden whale. He did not have it to give. Dawn came on in the way dawn sometimes comes on at sea, a gradual lightening that makes the world you know appear first as guesswork, and then as fact. The Iron Fleet's masts stood against the pale like bones flensed of flesh and left clean. Gulls came and went with their gossip. Theon leaned on the rail and watched the course of their wake. Karstark's boy came to stand beside him, both hands on the rail in the same posture. He had the look of one who has done a thing and found it easier than he expected, and is now afraid all his life will be asked to be as easy. "I have never been at sea," the boy said, not to Theon, but to the world. "It feels to me as if the land were a habit we might unlearn." Theon said without thinking, "Everything is a habit you can unlearn if you do it too long." He thought of saying it more gently and did not. It was better a boy learned it now than at an hour when it would kill him. They made land 2 days later in a cove Theon remembered from childhood, as a place where he had dared himself to swim out to a rock that looked close, and had been 3 times as far as it seemed. Women stood on the shingle with baskets on their hips, and small children half hidden in their skirts, and men with their trousers rolled, and their feet planted, as if by planting their feet, they claimed the shore against all comers. The sea looked at all of them, and made no promise to be kind. On the highest rock, Balon Greyjoy waited, his mantle furred, and his hair blown straight back to show the shape of his skull. He looked like a monument to himself, and Theon felt weary and less brittle than he had expected. He climbed and stood not quite close enough to touch. "I brought you a burned city," he said. "The wolf brought you prisoners. We brought your name east on smoke. Will that do?" Balin's eye moved briefly, a glance that skimmed and cut and returned. "It will do for a dawn," he said. "And for the day. We will see whether the sun breaks the clouds," Balin said. And the raw humor of it surprised a laugh out of Theon that made Asha glance up. Victarion did not look. Victarion's world was ropes and hulls, and the sea's moods, and men were part of that only inasmuch as they obeyed. Aeron came up from the water with a handful of sand and let it fall through his fingers as if reading it. His gaze fell upon Theon at last, and did not condemn. It did not absolve either. It measured. Theon did not offer himself to be weighed. That night, the hall smelled of fish stew and smoke and wet dogs. Men sang in ugly voices about pretty things, and in pretty voices about ugly things. Theon drank enough to make his mouth warm and his hands slow. Asha told the story of the lift housekeeper who had sung himself into error, and the men laughed in the places men laugh. Victarion said once, "The gear held." And it was like a blessing. When Theon went out into the night to piss, the stars looked as if they had been thrown over the sky by a hand too casual about its glitter. He thought of Robb again, not with the warmth that used to come but with a complicated sensation like a knot made of different ropes. He wondered where the boy king slept now, and who watched him while he slept. He wondered whether Caitlin lay awake counting losses against gains, because mothers do that long after commanders have learned to do otherwise. He wondered whether a lion could be made to leave his cave twice in a lifetime for the same insult, and if he would, which way he would cross the river this time. He did not wonder long. The future comes like weather, and men go out in it with the clothes they have. The raven that came from the west 3 mornings later had gold floss left in its leg feather, absurdly, as if it had flown through someone's weaving and torn a thread. The word it bore was not long, but it was heavy. "Tywin moves," it said in the plain hand of a man who did not waste ink on flourish, west at speed. Robb's reply came ashore at Seaguard in the same breath, as if the two birds had flown wing to wing. "Good. The Riverlands untie. I pull to the neck and leave him to chase shadow and smoke. Meet me at Fair Market in a fortnight. Bring whatever ships you dare let the sea do without." Balin read that and grunted. Asha ran her tongue over the cut at her mouth and smiled because even pain can be companionable. Victarion looked at the sky and considered the winds that would hold, and the winds that would fail. Theon stood at the edge of the hall's light and felt the old urge to belong and the newer knowledge that belonging has sharp edges. He reached up and touched the kraken at his throat, and then the empty place above it where a wolf might have worn its own. On a hill east of Lannisport where trampled fields still showed the prints of men and hooves, Tywin Lannister dismounted and stood a long while, looking at the city with his mouth shut in a line that had cut him long ago and never healed. Smoke no longer rose dark. It lay like a patient under a sheet, gray and not dangerous, the kind that makes you wonder what else burns quietly under it. The men around him waited the way dogs wait when a man's mood is a bone they are not sure they are allowed to have. He said nothing. The silence lengthened until it seemed as if the air might break. At last he lifted his hand, palm up. "Bring me the harbor master," he said. "Bring me whoever held the chain, and whoever held him when he fell. Bring me the man who left the rope ungreased, and the boy who sang a wrong song. And bring me a map that does not lie." He looked at the city as if it personally had erred. "We will teach the West to be hard again." His men moved swiftly now because there was something to do, and doing is always easier than thinking. Tywin stood alone with the rock behind him, like a father you can neither escape nor impress, and the sea before him like a mother who refuses to love. He pressed his lips together and considered the future as one considers a board with too few pieces, deciding which sacrifice will buy the most turns. In Riverrun, Jaime Lannister sat in a tower room that had once been intended to house visiting septons and now held him, and heard the news as if it were a story told to a child to make him behave. He laughed aloud because it struck him as very funny that Lannisport should be sacked twice in a lifetime by men whose coat of arms was a sea monster no one had ever seen. Then he sobered because laughter does not warm you long when you begin to count the men who will die, so that you might someday be released to die a different death. Caitlin Stark read the same letter and did not laugh at all. She touched the line that said her son was unhurt, and folded the paper very precisely, and placed it under a small carved wolf on the table. She looked out of the window and thought of Winterfell, where she was not. She thought of Sansa and Arya, whose fates were letters with no seal. She thought of a lie she might tell herself that would let her sleep, and did not tell it, because she had always been an honest woman, and would not begin to be a liar to herself when truth might lull her less, but would keep her better. On the Iron Islands, in a hall that kept out wind as a courtesy and not as a promise, Theon Greyjoy sat with a bowl he did not bring to his lips, and listened to his sister's voice and his uncle's breathing, and his father's silence. He was as far from Robb Stark as a man can be, while still feeling the tug of a bond like a rope around his middle. The rope had not been cut. It had been thrown across a wider gap. Theon told himself he could always leap it, and he told himself he might not want to, and he told himself he had not decided. These were all true in their way, and not enough. He rose at last, and went to the door, because men do that when they want to be alone, and the hall will not let them. The wind was in off the bay, and the gulls had come back to squabble over something dead in the rack. Theon stood with his face to the spray, and wondered how long the quarrel in the west would last. Whether it would spill and make everything salt. He thought of a boy looking for a wooden whale, and of a man looking for a way to be two men at once. He thought of a wolf's blue eyes and a kraken's hard grip. He thought of Lannisport burning, and of Tywin riding. Of a chain falling, and a wolf at a gate, and a God who does not forgive, because the sea does not need to. He closed his eyes, and could still see the glow on the water. A spilt necklace of red across a black throat. He opened them, and the day was hard and ordinary and smelled of kelp. He could not guess. No man could. Which way the great tides of the war would go now that they had been tugged, both east and west. He only knew there would be more wind. He stood to it, straight and stubborn, and felt it bite his face, and did not step back. That is how he stood when Asha came and slapped his shoulder, and told him a joke about a lion who learned to swim badly. That is how he stood when Victarion's voice came behind them, saying the tide was right, and Balon expected men to remember how to move when told. That is how he stood when he had nothing left to stand on but the bones he had been given, and the choices he had already made, and that was enough for one breath, and then the next, and then the next. A.K. Robb Stark moved like weather through the Riverlands, and men adjusted their lives around him. He took his counsel astride more often than at any table. It was a habit born of speed, and the knowledge that tables are for men with more time to be wrong. The late summer had turned languid where it could in the hedgerows and orchards, but in the lanes and on the fords, the world had the tautness of a bowstring. Men slept in their boots, ate in their saddles, spoke in murmurs and hand signs more than words. That was how the boy who had been a ward in Winterfell, and became a king in a fortnight, learned to keep an army in his hands without gripping until it broke. When the letter from the Isles reached him under a ragged elm whose bark showed the long scars of cartwheels, he read it twice without letting his face move. The Ironborn would continue their work on the western shore. The letter said with that spare assurance that came when men wrote with salt on their fingers. Tywin Lannister moved west at speed. Fairmarket in a fortnight, if the rivers and the gods allowed it. Caitlin watched her son's eyes, which was how she watched his thoughts now. When boys grow into men, they learn to hide them where mothers cannot reach. He folded the page with a precision she recognized from Eddard, and tucked it away as if carefulness could guard it from any harm. "We draw him after smoke," Robb said, looking not at the map, but at the fields beyond it, where hyrics stood in the sun and swallows stitched the air. "We make him ride heavy and angry, and we make him choose which house burns and which is saved. While he chooses, we move." The great John cracked a knuckle with a sound like a small log on a fire. He rumbled. "Let him choose, and we'll take choice's leavings. A lion's tail is long, but he can't swat every fly on himself at once." "Dandawan." "Edmure sits a castle with a river under him," Lady Mage Mormont growled. Her braid looped twice around her neck like a practical garrote. "He'll want to show himself a man to his folk. You'll need to write him letters with iron in the ink." Robb's mouth thinned, not with anger but with the concentration of a man fitting moving pieces in his mind. Caitlin could almost see the shapes in the air before him. the blue forks of the Trident, the road that led from the Golden Tooth, the long pull of the Gold Road into the west, Lannisport, the Rock's shadow, a Kraken's coils, Edmure's pride, Tywin's temper, the Blackfish's eyes like winter water. "I will write my uncle," he said, "and I will send the Blackfish to whisper in his other ear." He sent men as if they were messages, and wrote messages as if they were men. Quick and lean, and meant to arrive with the point still sharp. Theon rode with the first packet, because it was his way now to live between two obligations, as if riding the line between two fields, and refusing to step into either. He took with him a Karstark captain, and 6 of the quiet men Robb trusted to bring words through trouble. They splashed across the Blue Fork at a ford where the water ran calf-deep and cold enough to make their bones ring, and came up the bank beneath alder and willow scrub. A boy with a basket of trout on his head stepped out and saw the wolf on Theon's breast, and the kraken on his throat, and ran, dropping a fish with a heavy flop. Theon stared at it a moment, and then nudged it back into the stream with his boot, because letting the thing die on dust offended him in some part of himself he didn't choose. At Seaguard, Lord Jason Mallister received him on the high stair, with his gull banner stirring in the sea wind, and an expression on his face like a man who has learned to be polite to every letter the tide brings until he has read it. When he heard Tywin moved west, he smiled without warmth. "He rides to put out a fire, and finds his old house full of unbanked embers," Mallister said. "God send him a good pair of boots, for he will be standing in ashes for a while." Theon slept a few hours by the sound of the bay of seals breathing in and out, and rose at first light to ride inland, through barley fields whose beards caught the sun like old men's laughter, along hedged lanes where thrushes scolded them as if they were boys stealing eggs. Everywhere the war had left the little signatures that those who do not fight leave behind them: mended cartwheels, hedges that had been cut to feed cattle when pastures were trampled, ricks protected by brush laid around them in patterns a child could tell were defensive. Theon looked at those things with the eye of a man who has burned and taken, and always meant to. He did not tell himself lies about it. At the Twins, Walder Frey's hall smelled as it always smelled, which was to say of meat kept too long and a kind of brine that was not the sea's and should not be any kitchens. The old man stared at Theon over hands like a bird's feet, and asked 3 times, in 3 different ways, whether Robb meant to bring his army across again soon, and whether the toll would be paid in coin or promises. "Coin," Theon said cheerfully, "because sometimes the quickest way past a nettle is to push through it. Promises too, if you like them. It is a king who offers. Kings' promises make knives dull and spoons bright. You can eat with them for a while. Until the king chokes." The Lord of the Crossing cackled, delighted with his own wit, and clapped his hands for wine. Edmure and the Blackfish met Theon in a small chamber at River Run that still had a store of the old air, the smell of rushes rubbed with sweet herbs, and a hint of the stones cool. There were maps, because there are always maps, though Theon had come to dislike them where once he had loved them. Maps are lies drawn prettily. They leave out all the things men die on. Tywin wants the Gold Road, and if he cannot have it, he will take the black lanes and hedge paths, Sir Brynden said, tapping the parchment with a long finger. He must cross here or here. The nail touched the mills and shallows that the Tullys had counted for 3 centuries and more. The knowledge of water and where it goes, that is a river lord's inheritance. "We can keep him on the south bank and harry him the whole way west," Edmure said quickly, the color in his face high. "Avoid battle and bleed him. Make him pay in horseflesh and pride." The Blackfish's eyes flicked at Theon, measuring the drift of another current in the room. Theon resisted the urge to be flippant. He had learned, too late, and piecemeal, that jests are the little brothers of fear, and not always the most useful of kin. "Robb wants you to let him cross," Theon said. "Wants him drawn along a road he thinks he chose." Edmure flushed more deeply, like a man told to stand aside at his own gate. Catelyn had written, so Theon did not need to say that, and yet the room felt as if he had said it anyway, out of turn and out of blood. "I am Tully of River Run," Edmure said. The words were not boast. They were a statement of the problem, and of his intention to solve it. "I will not see Lannister hosts move unchecked along my banks, while folk look out of their doors to count them," and wonder whether their house is next. Sir Brendan's mouth did not smile, but his eyes did, a very little. Obstinacy is a Tully art, he murmured. Some men play the harp. We damn rivers. Theon held his hands out, empty. He was not a Tully, or a Stark, or anything a river could keep or yield. He had never learned the art of obstinacy that feeds itself on belonging. I will carry back what you do, not only what Robb asks, he said, because it was the one truth he could promise these men without lying to himself or to anyone else. He left them then with more courtesies than he liked, and fewer than they deserved. He slept an hour on a bench in a room with a slit of window where swifts darted to feed their young under the eaves. He woke with a start, because he had dreamed of Lannisport's smoke again, and a boy's wooden whale bumping against a quay, piling as if it lived. He told himself it was only that his mind disliked undone stories. It was not the only reason. Tywin Lannister rode west with smoke in his nose and insult under his tongue, and the one steadied the other. He had little use for anger unless it could be harnessed to something that would not break under it. He found in himself now that curiously cooling heat. Rage turned to will, as when a smith takes a piece of iron too hot for his hand and uses tongs he forged years ago exactly for this purpose. Kevin rode to his right, steady as the 10th mile of any march. Adam Marbrand had the outriders ahead and sent back reports with the neat economy of a man who has learned that flourishes and evasions both cost horses. Sir Gregor Clegane ranged, not as far as Tywin sometimes let him range when he wished to terrify a country into giving up, because this was not a terror campaign, but a race. The Riverlands were a map of old resentments and recent slights. Tywin had learned every ditch and dike by other men's mistakes. Now he put those lessons on like a second shirt and rode. At the first ford he meant to cross, a broad shallow that had been mended only indifferently after the last season's floods, he found river-run banners, leaping trout in blue and red, rippled with the same wind that rippled the water. Edmure Tully had come with men who showed a kind of fierce politeness when they set their pikes in the mud. Their lines could not keep every clump from turning to mess in the silt, but the men who stood in them had learned how to find their feet again quickly in such conditions. The archers behind them had the patience fishermen have when they know the fish will rise eventually. Tywin watched all this from a small rise. He took his time, because time taken early is 10 times more costly when snatched later. He looked at the ford, the cut of the banks, the way the willows leaned, the tongue of gravel where horse hooves would slip and men would curse. He sent his horse back and walked down with Adam Marbrand, the two of them getting their boots wet in a manner that surprised the men nearby enough to make their mouths part a little. Tywin did not notice, which was part of why men followed him. He put his fingers in the current and felt its pull, the way one feels a pulse. Then he stood and wiped his hand on his cloak and said, "Not here." They rode downriver, then up, found other places, found red fish, and blue banners, and rivermen who had teeth. For 3 days it went like that. A dance where one partner meant to lead, and found the other determined not to follow steps he had not chosen. In the end, there was the stone mill, with the water churning around its pilings and the miller's house long burned by some earlier raiding party. Here the bank was cut in a way that could be used, and the mill itself gave cover to a crossing if a man could get his first troops over and hold a wedge. Tywin set his jaw like a man holding a nail steady for the first hammer blow and nodded. Here. The fight at the mill was not grand. Men will speak of grand battles, as if the gods descend to arrange their banners and give speeches. This was a wet and hungry thing, with men slipping and cursing and grabbing for one another, not to save but to pull down, with horses flailing and eyes gone white with the water in their ears, with archers fixing their stance against the slight tremor of the planks and reminding their shoulders of a dozen childhood games. Edmure Tully fought in person where the wedge would have been, because he understood that sometimes a lord's body is an argument more convincing than any horn. Tywin did not go down, because a general's body is an argument only when he means to gamble everything. And this was not that hour. He watched. He sent. He responded. By dusk the mill's paddles creaked again, because rivermen are practical, and because someone reminded someone else that grain spoils if it waits. Tywin drew his line back 100 paces and set fires under cauldrons, and put men to rubbing down horses with handfuls of grass that had grown where no army yet had set its foot. Across the water, River Run's men shouted the last little victory shouts men allow themselves when they have stopped a thing, if not broken it. Edmure stood under a willow with his hair dripping and his mouth tight, and said nothing, because victory tastes odd when it is only the absence of defeat. Sir Brynden touched his shoulder briefly and then walked on. When Theon found them there the next day, bringing Robb's new words and the sea smell that never left his clothes now, he felt the currents in the air as a sailor feels a change of wind on his face before the pennants know. "You held him," Theon said lightly, "because he lacked the art of saying a thing without seeming to say it at someone." "We held him because he wished to cross and we told him no," Edmure said. His eyes were red from smoke and the wind and from anger that he was determined would be his, not anyone else of him. The cost was not small, and the cost could have been greater. "The river is my blood." Robb wanted him west, Theon said. And only after said, "I do not say this to scold you with what you know. I say it so that the words are in the air with the rest of them." "Bah. Your king is my liege," Edmure said. "And my sister's son. He is not a river." Sir Brynden's mouth moved. It might have been a smile or a grimace. It might have been the memory of a winter trout pulled from under the ice with careful fingers. "We will send him the news prettily wrapped," he said. He has use of pretty wrappings sometimes. When Theon left them, he had the taste in his mouth of metal and leaf mold, both. He rode with 2 men along a lane that had been hedged against rabbits, and was now by necessity hedged against men. A woman stood in a gap and watched them pass with a child on her hip. The child waved, aimless and delighted by motion. The woman did not. Theon lifted his hand and then lowered it, aware of the weight of the Kraken pin in a new way, as if it were drawing his whole arm down. Robb took the news of the stone mill with quiet. He did not throw anything, which the Great John would have done. He did not laugh, which the Blackfish sometimes did when men disobeyed him cleverly. He did not pace. He fed Grey Wind with a strip of dried meat, and scratched the wolf's chest in that place he liked, and the great gray animal closed his eyes as if a small summer had settled on him for a heartbeat. Then Robb turned to the map, not as to a plan, but as to a friend who had told him a hard truth. "He is pinned there a while," Robb said. "Good. We pin him where he will be hungry. We peel the west until his people cry out to him louder than pride does." Nander. Caitlin watched the little line deepening between his brows. It had not been there when he was a boy. She wanted, with a desperate suddenness she hid very well, to reach and smooth it with her thumb, as she had when he was 5, and scowled at a knot in a lace. She folded her hands because there are some impulses a mother must learn to bear as pain and not act upon, if she would have her son remain a man. The Ironborn will need to be reminded they are allies, not locusts. She said softly. They hear the word sack, and they stop their ears to all else. "I will remind them," Theon said quickly, eager without meaning to be seen as eager. Asha hears half the words the first time, and all of them the second. Victarion hears only the ones that sound like the sea, but he keeps those. Robb's eyes went to Theon and held there a moment, and the boy's low chuckle that used to follow any glance between them did not come. "Go then," he said. "Go with my thanks. Tell them that the boys they took in red cloaks will fetch coin and ransom if they are returned with their hands and feet attached, and will fetch only laughter if they are returned as heads. Tell them there are warehouses in Casey and in the Banefort that have spices and tin and bolts of cloth. The Reach will weep to have denied them. Tell them there are villages I will not see burned. Then, you are sending him with mercy to men who eat iron for breakfast," the Great John muttered. "I am sending him with sense," Robb said, and the Great John, who respected sense less than courage, but had learned to fear it more, snorted and let it pass. Theon went west again, not by the same road because roads remember men too, and set ambushes on their own with nothing but their own turns and ditches. He learned to see the war not as a line but as a weather system. Swirling here, lowering there, with tiny eddies that showed in things as small as the way a baker gave him a look, or the way a dog did not bark when he passed. Once he slept in a hayloft and woke to find a boy watching him with his chin on the rail, grave as a judge. The boy had tied both his shoes together with a piece of straw, a small trick of mischief that kept the world human. Theon untied them and laughed and gave the boy a copper and felt better for a mile and worse for 2. At Case, Asha had left a message in the only way a harbor town makes sure messages go where they must. Carved on a post in the yard of the alehouse where shipwrights drank. In that half-letter, half-mark script such men use when their hands learned oars before quills. She had gone south along the coast, the carving said, and would turn again west at the first rocky promontory. The words were cut deep and sure. Asha did not like to be misunderstood or erased. Theon reached her at a cove, with a tide like a long, slow breath, and a row of black cormorants on a rock, drying their wings as if they were monks airing prayers. She was sitting on the boulder that made the last rough seat before the sea, her boots off, and her toes dug into the weed slick where little crabs hid. Victarion's ship rode beyond, severe as a sermon, his men moving on her like the automata in an Isos shrine clock. "You ride like you were trying to wear the ground out," Asha said without turning. "Did the wolf send you, or did boredom?" "Both," Theon said, dropping down beside her and letting his legs dangle. The water touched his boots with that friendly intimacy the sea reserves for those who have learned not to insult it. He asks for clever theft and mercy. He asks that you take what costs them and avoid what costs nobody. He asks that you remember, men expect him to be a boy and would like to be surprised. "Liu and Timni," Asha snorted. "I am to be legate of the boy's virtue to a family whose big idea upon waking is to put fire under something. Well and good, I can do both. The trick is the order." He told her of Tywin on the river, of Edmure's damming, of the stone mill. She listened with that slight tilt of the head that meant she was assembling the story for herself and putting together the parts she could use. Victarion came ashore, heavy-footed and deliberate, and stood a little away, as if the tide line had meaning for him, even on dry ground. "Casey?" Theon asked. "Banefort. You could take 9 shiploads of tin out of the Banefort storehouses and make half the smiths in the West weep into their aprons." "Tin is heavy," Asha said, as if discussing whether a man's boots were worth stealing. "But heavy things have their use when you put them in the right boats. There's a warehouse in Casey with the reached pepper, and men cry if pepper is scarce. Crying men make lords' wives angry, and lords' wives make lords mean." She wiggled her toes. "We will take pepper and tin, if I can make Victarion lift his eyebrows at the idea. We will do as the wolf asks with a little artistry, because I prefer getting credit for artistry." Victarion's eyebrows did lift, the smallest possible increment, when Theon spoke of ransom for gentle-born boys. "Coin spends," he said. "Heads do not. A head is meat for gulls and gods. The god is not hungry." Menau. Aeron Damfair washed up out of the sea and stood on the shore like a story told by an older man than any of them. He smelled of the weeds that cling to pilings and something else, older and cleaner. His eyes were bright and his hair roped with salt. "The god is satisfied for now," he said. "He has been paid in fear. Pay him now in thanks. Take what the ocean gives you and throw back the small fish. A net overloaded breaks." Theon did not know whether to be relieved that the priest approved the word mercy, or irritated that mercy was being treated as a fisher's trick. He took what he could get. It is a lesson for any man who lives between two tides. In Case, a citizen of middling prosperity, who held a lease on 3 warehouses, discovered that prayers made to carved gods are less useful than understanding the habits of dock hands. Asha took the pepper under his nose and left him a paper. An actual paper, with her bold, awkward hand, that said the Ironborn were not gods, and could sometimes be reasoned with. And that if he sent a cartload of his own choosing to 3 named widows, in 3 named alleys, she would leave his 4th warehouse untouched the next time she came. The man fulfilled the order down to the last sack, and then stood under his eaves and cursed her for her impertinence. Then he cursed the Lannisters louder because cursing them was safer when the Ironborn were near, and would do for either when they had gone. At the Banefort, the Lady Banefort, whose hair was more iron than gold now, and whose mouth had the kind of grimness inherited by women whose men go often to sea, stood on the rampart and watched longships slide along her horizon like spearheads. She had 3 daughters behind her and a son too young to be of much use with anything but enthusiasm. She sent for a priest and had the chapel opened and stood under its roof a little while. Then she came out and set men to hiding the tin, where even men who knew tin would not think to look. She had learned long ago that prayer makes better work when accompanied by a good hiding place. The Ironborn took what was easy and ignored what was hard, where doing so served their story. Victorian burned a sloop being built for some merchant house's showy son, and watched the flames eat the fresh timber with a satisfaction like prayer indeed. Asha found the cart roads and made them her web, and did not let them burn a granary that would feed 3 hamlets. She said she did not do it for the hamlets but for the story. Theon pretended to believe her because it made both of them more comfortable than any other answer. On the 3rd day, a Lannister patrol came out of the hills, with a captain who had the look of a man promoted 2 years sooner than was sensible. He rode stiff and held his sword upright, as if the blade were his claim to seriousness. They ran to Asha's rear guard near a long wall with a line of oaks behind it, and the first blood was almost gentle. Horses rained, a measure of arrows, the light clatter of iron on iron. Then the captain tried to dash his men in with a shout, and the thing became real. Asha moved like a cat among dogs, not faster than any of them, but sure of which angle on which dog's leg would trip the whole pack. Theon saw her cut a stirrup leather, and then the throat above it, step away from the spray, and throw her knife into a man's wrist with a little twist that made the fingers open, and let the sword drop. He took a horse himself with a low stroke, and regretted it at once because the animal screamed before it fell, and that noise had a way of not leaving a man's head for the rest of the night. He did not have time to be sorry long. Victorion's men held their line like a dock under storm, and the Lannister patrol curled and broke, and the captain went down with a look of astonishment, as if death had been pointed out to him in a crowd, and he had not realized it had been near all along. After, Asha took 4 boys who had the look of better houses about them, belt pouches too neat, haircut by servants, and spared them the roughness her men would have given, because the wolf's request still rang in her head, and because she had decided she liked to see Lannister gold turned back on itself. She sent them to the ships under guard, and told Victorian they would buy sailcloth and pitch, and the quiet speech of older sailors. "You are playing at respectability," he told her without quite accusing. "I am playing at profit," she said. "You play at sermon. We both like games." Then, Theon rode alone for a while that afternoon along a ridge where the wind had cut the summer grasses down to a nap, like old velvet. He could see west to where the sea made a bright, hard line, and east to where the land folded into itself, and the far river lay like a strip of pewter. He thought of Robb somewhere under that river's weather, and of Tywin on a bank someplace making a shape of his mouth that made other men careful, and of Catelyn sitting with her hands folded on a letter so precisely that no edge stuck out, no corner peeped. He thought of Balon on his rock, and Aeron in his surf, and Victorian polishing something in himself as he polished iron. He tried to guess where he would be in a month, and the guess failed. The future is a kind of weather too. Sailors learn to say only what the tide will do in the next hour. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister discovered that there are days when one piece of news makes 7 others different by its presence. Lannisport burned had been enough to set a dozen books of account to weeping. Tywin moving west meant he must count what he had in the city as if a siege were tomorrow, and not when Stannis Baratheon chose to look up from his own maps. He spoke to Hallyne of the pyromancers in a room that smelled like a mine disguised as a chapel, and made himself listen to the man's soft glee about quantities and green fire. "Do not spend your joy too quickly," Tyrion said. "Men set themselves alight with it, and then lack enough to kindle the fire they actually need. We will have your wildfire when I ask for it, and we will put it where I tell you, and if any more of your apprentices lose their eyebrows telling the stuff their secrets, I will have them shaved of anything that might catch and set them to stirring pots of soup in Flea Bottom, until they sweat the foolishness out." Men and show. He put men on the walls and had them drilled not to drop their spears when the heat came. If heat came, and sent for Bronn because Bronn was a bestiary, all to himself, and the only creature in it that did what he was told as long as doing so amused him. He looked in at Joffrey, who was practicing with a crossbow again, and did not say any of the dozen things that would have been satisfying and worse than useless. He sent ravens with letters that might be read only when the men who should have read them were already dead or victorious. He slept badly and dreamed not of dragons, as men do in stories, but of ledgers in which the sums refused to stay where he put them. At Harrenhal, which Tywin had left and Roose Bolton meant to take as slowly as a man puts his hand into a sack, he suspects may contain a snake. The great stone held the echo of orders no longer spoken there. Roose moved through those halls with that quiet he could not be shaken out of, and every step he took seemed to dampen sound around it. Men who followed him spoke softer without meaning to. He accepted the castle from men who had guarded it badly by the simple expedient of arriving in more number than they could count, and telling them that if they attempted to be difficult, he would make it so their difficulties ended at their necks. He set men to knock the rust out of the pantries and to boil the vats that had been used for butchery and might be used for other things. He wrote a letter to Robb with a delicacy in the hand that would have pleased any septa teaching a careful child, and in it he did not mention that he had flayed 3 men who had taken to ambushing his foragers. He put a dot in the right place in the word Harrenhal, and sealed the letter with a square methodical press. Catelyn sat at River Run and did the arithmetic of love and war, as if it were any other ledger, and could be balanced by long enough stubbornness. She spoke with the Blackfish in his spare way, and with Edmure in his eager way, and with herself in the manner of an honest woman who does not flinch from the things she would like to flinch from. She heard that Tywin had been held at the fords a day, then 2, then 3. She did not rejoice. A held enemy is still an enemy, and sometimes more dangerous than a moving one. News travels like seeds on wind. Some of it falls on stone and some in ditches, and some in the good furrows of men's thoughts. Word of Lannisport went up the Mander and down the Tumblestone, and all the little brooks, and in inns men told the story with details that altered to please the mouth speaking them. How the chain fell, with a sigh, with a groan, with a clang. How many ships the Ironborn burned, 3,303. How the wolf came to the gate, with a word, with a blow, with a blow, with a word. The tales did their work. They made men see Lannister banners burned, and that did for Robb what a week of riding does for a thief. Gave him distance and time. Tywin got his crossing on the 7th day, not by the mill he had first chosen, but by a place the river had eaten away in the spring, and young willows had not yet declared their ownership of. He threw men there the way a gambler throws dice, and took his small loss with a face that did not alter, and then made his second throw heavier. Edmure's men fought with the hot tenacity of men for whom family and river are the same word. The water went red in thin ribbons that drifted down and widened, and some of the fish rose and snapped at the sweetness because fish are without decency. Before noon the first companies were over, and by evening Tywin had a bridge made of things men had once cared for. Wagons and doors and 2 folding trestles that had held meals in a merchant's yard, and 5 corpses at the worst hour of it. He took 1,000 men west that night, and left men to hold the bridge, and frowned when a man complimented him on the cleverness of using trestles. "We are not at a fair," he said, and sent the man away. By then, it was too late for the kind of relief that would have pacified every household that smelled smoke on its shirt. Lannisport had gone through its first 3 griefs: shock, rage, counting. The counting took longest. Men ran their fingers along shelves and across ledgers, and made the sound men make when they find a thing and do not like the finding. The city's guilds met without their old ease. They spoke in the new style, short and without wit. The dockside whores learned to say no in a new tone to a new caliber of men, and to say yes faster when coin flashed, to make the yes and no equal in their mouths where once they had not been. A woman whose work had been dye learned to boil nettles in misery and get a green that was not the green the Reach ladies liked, but would have to do. A girl found a wooden whale caught under a piling, and took it home and set it on a shelf, because she liked the way the wood held the sea's polish on it. She did not know she had salvaged anything anybody mourned. She loved it for its smoothness, and for the story it made in her head. She never used it to play at drowning. In the Isles, Balin Greyjoy held a feast whose roughness would have insulted a great house and pleased his. Men sang. Men banged their cups. Aeron stood and spoke, and made the sea itself seem like a task set before them, and not merely a thing to float on. Victarion stood and did not speak, which was his form of benediction. Asha stood on the table and told a story about a case magistrate who had tried to buy her off with a purse too small and a smile too eager. In her telling, the man ended under his own cart when a wheel came off at just the right moment and the right angle. The men laughed and the women laughed too, and Theon laughed because he must, and because the story was good, and because it is better to laugh in your father's hall than to sit quiet in the corner. After, in the darkness that comes in little pieces indoors, when torches die like tired men, Asha put her hand on Theon's arm and squeezed hard enough to make him feel the shape of her fingers long after. "You are sailing between," she said. "That is a dangerous channel. The rocks there don't show their heads in every tide. The tide is the same on both shores," he said, and she made a sound that might have been approval and might have been only acknowledgement. He did not ask her which. Robb broke camp and moved again, as he had promised himself he would. He ran 100 small tricks up the sleeves of the riverlands. The way he never used the same pasture twice for the same company in a week. The way he had men ride 2 miles out of their way to spoil the ground at a ford he did not mean to use. The way he always set his healers on the flank where he expected the least trouble, so that their fires would be the light some band of brigands took for an unguarded rear. He wrote again to Edmure. He wrote to Roose. He wrote to 2 minor lords whose names Catelyn had to remind him of. Not because he scorned them, but because the war had shattered the drawers in his mind where such facts had once been tidy. He wrote to White Harbor and to the Fingers, and he wrote to the Isles with a brevity he knew Balin would prefer to any courtesy. Theon took that letter too. It said only this: "Keep your oars in time with my infantry, and I will keep my cavalry in time with your tide." He read it and smiled, because it sounded like Robb. No poetry, only rhythm. He thought of tossing it and telling the words without the paper, and did not. Men who burn letters always imagine a poetry to the ash that does not reach the person intended. When he reached Pike this time, the sky was low, and the wind heavy with a storm that might choose to land on them, or to drag itself north and do its drinking there. Balin stood under the gate with rain on his face, and did not seem to notice it as water, and not something else. He held Robb's words as if the parchment were made of peelable metal. He nodded once, and then again. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement that the numbers matched on both columns. "We will give him what he wants so long as it is what we want," he said. "When those two are no longer the same, we will give him nothing." "What if what he wants and what you want are never exactly the same again?" Theon asked, and hated himself instantly for putting the word exact in it. A southern word. A boy's word. Balin's eyes moved. He did not smile. Sometimes men like him smile, and you wish they had not. "Then we will see whether the boy learns to swim in colder water." Aeron muttered a prayer under his breath. Or maybe only a memory of one. He stood so near to Theon that Theon could feel the damp off the priest's hair on his cheek. "You look both ways and call it prudence," Aeron said softly. "One day you will choose and call it fate." "That day is not today," Theon said aloud, partly to make it true, partly to hear the steadiness of his own voice. "Today, I am a letter. Tomorrow, I am a man again." Mensa wasn't. Victarion set sail with the tide because he always did, because habits that have saved your life 3 times are worth honoring even when you cannot remember each time distinctly. Theon watched the prow knife the swell, and thought of the way Robb set men in a V like geese on migration, when he moved them fast, and the similarity made him smile in a way that had no humor in it at all. When Tywin reached Lannisport at last, and set his horse where he could look at the harbor without smelling every old burn, he made a fist and then opened it again. A man remembering that hands are for holding, and not for breaking things you would prefer mended. He set men to shovels, and to ledgers, and to letters to the rock commanding levies, who had not thought they would ever need to pick up spears to do so, because the rock has a way of making men think themselves immune. He sent for Davin because Davin had a way of saying yes that did not sound like surrender, and for Stafford because Stafford needed to be told what no polite man would say to him, but that a useful one must hear. He sent for the harbor master. He did not have the man beaten in public, because public beatings are performances, and this was not theater. He had him dismissed privately, with a sentence spoken as if to a dog. "Go home." The man did so, and found no home. His wife already had her belongings on a cart, because she had guessed a day earlier than he had, and his son would not look him in the face. Tywin always understood that when punishment happens in a dozen kitchens, it is more effective than when it happens in one square. He knew this because he had been a boy once, and boys know where pain sits in a house. He sent ravens. He sent gold. He sent threats folded into courtesy. He slept 3 hours, and woke when his body decided he had slept enough. He thought once of Joanna, and of the one time she had taken him by both hands, and turned them palms up to look at the calluses there, and said she loved him for being a man who used his hands for work, and not for idle games. It was rare for him to think of her during work. Perhaps age had made him indulgent, in a way he did not admire. He dismissed the thought, because it had no use. So the days and the distances did what they always do. They wore at men and made their edges different than they had been. Theon learned, possibly a week late and definitely with a kind of undignified relief, that a thing can be done long enough to make it a shape you can lean on. He leaned on the shape of being between, and found it held long enough to get him into the next hour. Asha leaned on the story she was telling about herself, and it held too, because stories told over salt tend to stick. Victarion leaned on the sea and had no reason to doubt it would catch him if he fell. Edmure leaned on his river. Robb leaned on his men. Catelyn leaned on her honesty. Tywin leaned on his will and the weight of his name, which is a kind of shaping of the world hard to undo. At Fairmarket, Robb came with as much quiet as a king can bring to any place. He slipped men in along byres and over the meadows where sheep had gnawed the grass too close, and he put them into the town not as a flood, but as a seep through the seams, and suddenly Fairmarket was a northern town in its occupations. Sharp menders, quick cooks, men with axes. He kept the market going because there is no better cover for an army than the sound of bartering. No lord's hall has as much noise without direction as a market day. He set his tents where the ground would drain if it rained. He kept his horse lines well away from the bakers. Men fight better if they smell bread than if they smell shit. Theon came in at dusk and saw a gray wind first, because seeing the direwolf had always been the way to find the boy. The animal moved along the edge of a field, with a step both casual and avian. "This is mine. This is mine," and put his nose up into the wind and then set it down again because what he wanted was still behind him, not ahead. He saw Theon and came forward with that pleased economy wolves have. He did not hurry, but one understood that he could have. Robb stood with his hands behind his back, the way Eddard had stood when listening to men who wanted too much of him. He smiled at Theon with that sudden flash of the old boy, and drew him into his shade, as if that could shelter either of them from what the next month would bring. "You brought me the Isles' temper, and not only their story," he said. "Good. I do better with temper than with tales." "The tales are kinder," Theon said, then wished he had not. Asha respects the color of coin. Victarion respects ropes that do not slip and gear that does not fail. Aeron respects the god. Balon respects himself. Pick your words accordingly, and you will get what you want in pieces that fit together without scraping. "Madame Sly." Robb laughed and put a hand to Theon's shoulder and pulled him a step aside as a groom trotted a horse past with a water bucket banging against his knee. "I wish you could write that down and send it to me every morning," he said. "I would set it to the tune of an old song and whistle it when I had to talk to Karstark." In the next hours they spoke of little things, because little things make large ones carryable. Food stores. Hoof fungus. The way a man from the neck had taught them to waterproof a leather cloak better with boiled nettles than with any wax. How many boys they had taken at Lannisport, and what names their mothers would answer to if ravens went, and whether those mothers would have coin enough to make the ravens worth the feathers. They spoke of Tywin, always and again, in that tone men use when speaking of weather that has set in for a week and shows no sign of changing. Edmure held him, Robb said. I did not want him held there. I wanted him worn thin down the gold road. We will make use of what we have instead of what I wished. Wishes are for nights when you are too tired to do sums. Ben? Theon thought of Caitlyn's hands folding the letter and said nothing. Grey wind settled at Robb's feet and closed his eyes and put his head down on his paws and sighed in that deep way that sounds like resignation in a man and is only comfort in a wolf. Before dawn they were moving again, little streams of men and horses pouring themselves into the single river of the road. Theon rode with Robb's guard, and the air tasted like a brewing storm and dry summer dust both, which is the taste of change when you have lived long enough to know it. They passed a group of women gathering windfalls in aprons and in the hems of their skirts, and one of them straightened and looked at the line of men and did not specially distinguish Robb among them. He liked that she did not. Kingship sits best in the world when it does not need strangers to recognize it. The day wore through like a rough shirt. At noon a man came with a message from Roose that said he had Harrenhal and did not plan to make a drama of it. He disapproved of drama in any case. At mid-afternoon a raven came back to Theon from Asha, a scrap with a smear of something that might have been grease or might have been sky. Pepper all the way north, it read, and a sketch of a snake with its tail in its mouth. He laughed out loud and Robb reached for the paper and laughed too. And the Great John asked what was funny, and when told, laughed as if he had heard a joke at a campfire about a man who drank himself under the table and woke under a woman, which is to say generously and without much understanding. That night they made their camp with the same brisk care and the same small comforts. Fires dug into the ground, cloaks shaken and laid out, meat cut and set to stew. Theon sat with Daisy Mormont, and two men whose names he could never keep, not because they were unworthy but because his head was tired of names. Daisy told a story about the crag and the way the men there had thought the women of Bear Island would not climb ladders, and he laughed, and then he did not, and he looked at Robb across the fire and thought of the ways a boy becomes a man, and the ways a man is chipped at to make a king. When sleep came, it came all at once, like a wet cloak thrown over a flame. He dreamed again, but not of Lannisport. He dreamed of Pike. In the dream, the rope bridges were tighter, the wind quieter, and Balin stood upon a bridge with his mantle blowing like something unloosed. He held one end of a rope, and Robb held the other, and the rope ran between them over a drop whose depth the dream refused to show Theon because it would have woken him. Balin smiled and let his end go, and Robb smiled and tied his end to his belt, and Theon woke with his heart pounding, as if a wave had run over him and sucked the sand from under his feet. He rose, pissed, walked the perimeter where the guards moved like bits of night blown out of shape by wind. He stopped by Grey Wind because that had become his own superstition. Touch the wolf and the next hour will not do anything you cannot answer. He put his hand to the thick fur, and the wolf opened one eye and then closed it again, dishonoring the gesture completely and permitting Theon the comfort anyway. In the morning, a man died on the march of a thing that would have been called fever in an older time, and now had acquired a dozen names depending on which camp witch you ask. They buried him by a hedge with a line of willow staves planted around the small mound, because men must make the earth look different when it holds a friend, or it does not feel serious enough. Robb took his name and spoke it, and sent a horse back to his father with no man on it, which is a message any man understands without a letter. Caitlyn, receiving that horse a week later, stood with both hands on the animal's warm neck and did not cry, because she had learned that tears are a kind of private weather and not meant for courtyards. She permitted herself to think the name of the man, and in thinking, it made him live a little longer. Then she went back inside to hear Edmure's argument about the mill again, and to reassure two wives whose boys had not written, and to answer a letter from White Harbor that wanted more news and offered fish, because some kindnesses are too obvious to bear without smiling. Somewhere between the coast and the rock shadow, an old man in a cottage with a window small as a book looked up at the sound of boots in his yard and saw men with the lion on their shoulders. He lifted both hands because he had learned that sometimes it helps and sometimes it does not, and in either case, he preferred to be seen obeying. The men took his second best pot and his daughter's bread, but not his daughter, and he called that mercy and was content with it. Later, Ironborn came and took his third best pot and left him a little copper token that said he had been taxed, which made him feel oddly less angry. Men will forgive a thief if he admits to the profession and does it with style. At Lannisport's edge, a child with a wooden whale learned to put it in the bath and make it ride her hand-contrived waves. Her mother smiled because the child laughed, and then did not smile because she thought of a man and a boy she had seen in the smoke, and could not see their faces, and had decided that was a kindness the gods had offered her. She put a hand on the child's head and thought of the color of the flames. Not green, but ordinary orange-red, which is a sort of blessing when wildfire is in the mouths of men in other cities. Brienne of Tarth, who had come west in a company of sellswords, who respected her sword and did not speak much about her face, heard in an inn the story of the wolf and the kraken together, and frowned because fairy tales used to be simpler. Dragons or no dragons, wolves or lions, not wolves making pacts with sea beasts. She set her cup down and stood, and went to the stable and checked her mare's feet, and spoke to the horse in the voice she reserved for horses, and swore softly to herself that she would find Renly's killer in a world that continued being itself around that promise, which is a sort of insult the world does without malice. In King's Landing, Tyrion crossed the courtyard and saw Sansa Stark in a window like a painting, and felt a kind of pain that was not sympathy, and not lust and not quite pity either, but something like a man's stomach telling him he had eaten the wrong thing in the wrong order. He thought of the war in the West as numbers and men's names and horses, and then thought of it as a girl's next week, and this complicated his arithmetic beyond what any ledger could bear. He went to tell Cersei he would be dining in his own rooms because her company gave him indigestion, and she smiled at him with those eyes that always looked oldest when she was pleased with herself. By the time the fortnight had spent itself and a little more for good measure, the world had moved in its small ways and in 3 large ones. The small were too many to count and mattered to those in whose houses they happened. The large were these. Tywin was west of the Red Fork in strength. The Ironborn leaned on the coast like an old habit revived. Robb held his army together in a way that would not impress a poet but would make a mule nod. They met once more near Fairmarket, in a broken orchard where trees had not been tended the last 2 seasons, and bore misshapen fruit that tasted better than it looked, which is often the case with things neglected. Asha came inland farther than any Ironborn woman had cause to since the last time someone had been carried away by lust or by madness. She strode into the orchard with 2 men behind her, and leaned her shoulder against a tree, and bit into a pear, and made a face and laugh. "You fight like a man who wants to arrive before his own knees do," she said to Robb. "Good. That keeps the other fellow from seeing your intention before you have it yourself. You steal like a woman who wants to be admired for it," Robb said dryly. "Good. That keeps the other fellow from hating you efficiently." Then they stood with Theon between them because that was where he had put himself so often now that nobody thought to put him anywhere else. They spoke of Casey and the Banefort, and of the Rock's new requirements for harbor watch. More men, more lanterns, more pride, which Asha approved of as an adversary and despised as a citizen. They spoke of the boys taken at Lannisport, and the letters that had gone out, and the first little harvest of coins that had come back. They spoke of Tywin's march, and what the West looked like under his horse's hooves. "We will not meet him under a wall," Robb said. "He likes walls. We will never give him what he likes. We will make him drink bad water and sleep on wet straw and fight men whose names he doesn't know, and therefore cannot hate properly." Asha licked juice off her wrist and grinned. "If you ever sink," she said, "I might throw you a rope. And if you ever drown," Robb said, "I might teach you to swim." Theon watched the slant of the light on their faces and thought, with a sudden clarity that made his stomach hurt as if he were hungry, that this was the hinge his life had been searching for. A hinge that does not creak when turned because the door has been made so precisely it needs no forcing. He rode with Robb back to camp, under a sky that looked bruised in the west. In the night, a storm came finally, abrupt as anger and drenching as forgiveness. Men ran for cloaks and laughed, because real rain is a kind of luxury. It cleans more than it soaks. Theon lay listening to it drum on canvas, and he thought of Pike under storm and Winterfell under snow. and of the way the same water becomes different things depending on what roof it hits. He thought of the rope in his dream, and wondered what a man must do to learn a knot that cannot be untied by anyone but himself. In the morning the world smelled washed, the way it does when its old stories have been scrubbed a little but not changed. A rider from the south came in spattered to the eyes and swaying in the saddle like a man who had spent a night arguing first with his horse and then with his conscience. He brought a letter sealed in green wax, which men in the camp learned to fear the way soldiers fear a strange banner, the Queen's seal. Tyrion's hand inside said this after its courtesies. Stannis moves. He has boats and men who can row them, and the stubbornness of an uncle who has never liked any nephew. He asks Lannisport's smoke and hears it laugh. He says the word king with a sore tooth. We will receive him in our own way. Do not count on anything but your own horse and your own men's hunger. If the West bends you, do not bring your broken self here. He will devour you and pick his teeth with your banners. Robb read it and said nothing, and then folded it and tucked it away. Catelyn read it and closed her eyes briefly because she had had enough nephews and uncles to know what family means when men have crowns. Theon read it last, by a lamp, and smiled, because he liked Tyrion's words even when he did not like Tyrion's purposes. Look to your rope, he told himself in a whisper small enough that only he could hear it. Tie your own end well. Make the knot the only honest thing about you. He slept, and in his sleep he dreamed nothing at all, which is the best any man can ask of a bed in a season when the world moves like water in a storm tide. And the day came up again with its smells and its work, and the wind shifted slightly, and the apples in the broken orchard fell in the night and lay in the grass with dew on them like tears, and men who were not poets ate them and wiped their mouths with their thumbs and went to saddle their horses and lift their spears, and the war learned a new dance step while nobody was looking. The days that followed had in them that odd quality that comes when men know something large has turned and are waiting for the next groan of the timbers. Men sharpened their swords twice as often and dulled them half as fast. Smiths worked longer and said less. Scouts learned the taste of their own sweat and the precise squeak of each saddle they rode. Robb made of Fairmarket a hinge and swung his army on it without wrenching the door, and the Riverlands moved with him as far as they could. Ruts deepened, hedges made way. Women laid loaves out earlier and closed shutters later. He kept his counsel short and standing. Catelyn often stood apart at the edge of those little gatherings with her hands sheltered in her sleeves, as if she had tucked them into her own patience. She watched the way men looked at her son when they spoke to him. It told her more than their words. There were looks like the steady set of a plowman's shoulders, and looks like a huntsman's quick glance to see where the hounds made the turn, and a few like a boy's glance at the father, who has caught him at some mischief, and is deciding what lesson the boy may carry into manhood. Stannis will make his play, Robb said one morning when the river mist had not lifted, and the tents appeared to float as if on a gray tide. Tyrion will put a chain in a river or a torch to a barrel or both. That is how I would do, if I wore the wrong man's crown and wanted to keep it. We cannot help or hinder there. We can keep pressure where we have made a bruise. If Tywin turns back, the Riverlands breathe. If he does not, the West will cough blood until winter. Catelyn thought of King's Landing not as a city, but as a room with her child in it. She did not say so. She said, very level, write to Lord Manderley again. Ask for grain moved up the Trident by flatboat while the water holds. Men are brave when they have eaten bread and stubborn when they have eaten meat. I have written, Robb said. I will write again. Theon took that letter with other letters and went as a man goes down a known stair. Feel for the edge. Do not look. Trust your feet. He rode west first, because Asha's scratch mark letters on posts and lintels had become absurdly a kind of compass, and because he had learned that telling her a thing himself saved him the work of untying a knot later. He found her and Victarion at anchor under a shoulder of cliff where the wind was split and made into two kinder siblings. The shore there had a seam of black rock running through its face like a scar. Gulls used it. Asha used it. Theon liked it for its economy. They had a dozen captives who wore red lions on their brooches and pride on their mouths even with their hands bound. Asha had their names already and had kept two lads together because she did not like the sound one made when separated from the other. He made it less when his friend could put a shoulder to him, like colts in a storm. Victarion stood as if he had grown out of the deck, his men moving round him with the viscosity of men who have worked together until their labor is its own prayer. The wolf wants pressure on coin and bread, not blood for its own sake, Theon said, passing Robb's words through his teeth to make sure they came out with the right weight. Tin and pepper and wool. Ships that were meant to be ships. Not barns. Not women. Not children. Asha cocked her head. He likes a story in which he's the hero, even when the tale belongs to someone else. She said, but without malice, and with the haunted amusement of a woman who knows exactly which stories men will pay to hear twice. We can make him that story so long as it pays us. Victarion. Coin spends. Grain keeps men standing, Victarion said. Burn the ship houses. Seize the carts of tin. The wolf may have his gentleman back by the head, not the hair. By the head still attached, Theon said, and Victarion's mouth moved, which in him stood for encouragement. They moved on Case again, but not as flame this time. Asha had done her burning there to make the first point. The second point would be more deft. She dressed 4 of her men as carters and set them to a quarrel at the warehouse gate, loud enough to bring 2 sleepy apprentices and a foreman with a bad leg. While those 3 sorted the carters, a 5th ironborn slipped a pin out of the hinge of the small door that led to the clerk's room, and the ironborn came and went there like honest men all afternoon, carrying nothing, moving everything. When dusk fell, and the street filled with men and talk, and the smell of fish laid out for tomorrow, Asha whistled softly, and the carts rolled, downhill of course, because thieves who push up are poets with more passion than sense, and vanished into a yard 2 turns away, where a gate had been thoughtfully left unbolted by a woman, with ambition and a seaman-absent husband. The day's tale at Casey was of a scuffle at the gate, a woman scolding, a missing pin. The next week's tale was of a hard winter to come in the Betrothal, when tin was harder to come by, and shipwrights wanted payment before the wood was delivered. The Banefort had its pride like a hog has bristles. The Lady Banefort sent out riders with torches to make her roads look walked, and her walls look attended to. Asha watched the little moving lights and smiled, because she liked an opponent who did not sit and weep. She left them a warehouse intact by way of reward, and because she had judged the guards, there were men who would sell their own boots to buy blankets for their children. Such men, oddly, policed their own masters' accounts better when frightened. Theon did not say aloud how much he admired the neatness of this theft. He found a kind of relief in watching a woman steal with a conscience she refused to name. On another day, Theon rode inland with 6 men and a black-tied cousin, who had a sense of smell for grain that bordered on the supernatural, and they came upon feast fires, smoking in the last put-out way that tells the eye more than a great blaze does. Sir Forley Prester had been there, stern and competent. He had taken no foolishness from men who offered it, and had hung 3 who did. He had left a captain with 30 men, which looks like much until one remembers how many corners a granary has. Asha saw it and laughed. Victarion saw it and counted. They moved through the town like a draught of cold air in an oven, and when they came away, they had not left a ruin. Only a book with pages missing. Prester's 30 woke 2 mornings later to find their boots gone, their horses on the wrong hill, the steward's daughter married to the quietest ironborn among Asha's men before any father could object, and the tally sticks in the reeve's chest altered by a hand whose letters were a little too square to be Westerman. The effect was the same as fire and would last longer. Word ran in both directions, as it will. A boy in a red cloak took 3 breaths too many boasting to a tavern girl about Adam Marbrand's outriders. The girl was a K.C. Reeves' cousin who had anger put away neat on a shelf. She told a fishmonger whose brother had a nephew aboard an ironborn longship, waiting under a salt cliff. A rider who should have changed mounts at a farm at sunset found the farmer had given the fresh horse to a Northman at noon, because the Northman had paid in spices rather than coin and promised to send back a bolt of good cloth for the farmer's eldest girl. Little things make war in the same way little stones make landslides. Arya heard tell of all this in snatches and guessed the rest. Harrenhal raps sound oddly. It was a place that listened to itself over and over. Roose Bolton had made the halls quiet in a new way when he came. Men fledged their voices in their throats, and spoke them, only half-born. She listened anyway. She moved in silence where men looked too close, and she stole time. She had a cobbler's boy's quick hands, and the memory of Winterfell's maps in rooms where her father had not forbidden her feet. She swept and carried and brought linen and listened. They called her Nan Datul. They thought she had no place to store what she heard. They were fools. Roose sat with a strip of meat and a knife, and ate as if the act disgusted him, and he meant to master disgust by making it serve him. He asked soft questions and made men repeat themselves, so he could hear the difference between first words and second. He read the letters with his head tilted so that his hair fell away from his face and you could see the pallor under it. He sealed them with wax as dark as dried blood, and sent them away by men who had run long distances and would run longer. He never raised his voice, and once placed a hand on Arya's shoulder and said, almost kindly, "There is peace in the work that is in front of you." And she had to bite the inside of her mouth not to tell him what peace was and where it had gone. She watched the Dreadfort men, and she watched the Riverlands men, and she watched herself, which is the hardest watching and the most useful. A man with a braid behind his ear and a voice that made words slippery like fish came and went more than once under Roose's leave. Arya disliked him for a reason she could not make a word for. He carried himself like a man who remembered himself as something else, and had not wholly agreed to be a man. He watched her once and took 2 steps toward her, and then 3 away. She thought of Needle where it was hidden, and wished for it so hard that her wrists hurt. News of Lannisport came to Harrenhal like a fly coming into curry. First there is sweetness, then heat, then stings where you do not expect them. The men of the Riverlands smiled with the right kind of teeth when they heard, and the Dreadfort men did not smile and did not frown. They breathed and sharpened knives. Roose said, "A city burned is the shape of a foolish man's victory, but a city robbed of its coin and reputation is a victory a wise man can eat for months." Arya thought of Winterfell and asked the gods under her breath whether they would teach her to be wise the way her father had been, or the way men like Roose told themselves they were and were not. Tywin Lannister sat with a map of the West that had been worth 10 ransoms once and worth more now, because it had a lifetime of notes in 2 hands, his own and that of a clerk who had taught himself to be invisible. He set Adam Marbrand to cutting the raiding parties smaller and making them prettier. Give them jewelry, give them good coats, send them into towns with enough swagger that men see them, and not the men behind them. Once seen, they are counted, and once counted, feared more than they deserve. He sent Forley Prester east to look at the roads with that equanimity Forley wore, like a second skin, and to keep the levies from turning freebooters when no one looked. He did not sleep more than 2 hours at a piece, because his body did not require more, and his mind did not permit it. He dreamed, if he dreamed at all, of paper that did not tear when folded and bridges that held under any weight. He called Davin in his beard, a beard that grew like abundance and did not suit him, and said to him without preamble, "You will be the hand that wraps knuckles while I read. Chase the girl commander by the coast. Drive their carts inland. Fetch me a boy in a kraken brooch, and the sister who wears steel like a jape." Davin grinned because he liked the thought of a woman who hit hard enough to make him feel he had been in a fight. He said yes because he was a man who did not like to complicate his duty with conversation. So the West turned into a board with too many movable pieces, and Robb watched it the way a fox watches a hunter's dogs. Listen for the bell, smell for the wind, move only when the sound says move. He kept his men light, and his signals lighter. He sent the Greyjohn to break a levy assembling under Lord Sarsfield's younger cousin, and the Greyjohn obliged with laughter and a backhand, and came away with 3 dozen boys who would wear different cloaks and fight for a better story. He sent the Blackfish to look at the Golden Tooth from the north, not to take it but to remind it that men still looked at it with hungry eyes. Sir Brynden returned with a map annotated in that tight hand of his, and the single remarked that the house steward limped from an old break, and favored the stair with a handkerchief folded twice to make a wedge. Men who see such things are most dangerous to stone. The letter that changed the taste of the whole autumn came without fanfare at River Run, in the hour when kitchens do their morning violence, and the first bread turns the air into a thing men can stand to breathe. It said, in that neat formal hand that belongs to men who write truth, as if it were fiction to be doubted until proved. Jaime Lannister escaped his cell last night. The guards are dead. We are searching the banks, and we have riders on the east road and the south. Brienne of Tarth is gone. Catelyn's hand at the bottom was small and exact, and had not trembled. Edmure's underneath was large and blotted, and had. Robb received it standing, because he had taught himself that chairs are for matters finished. He read it twice and then again, and the third time the words made sense not to his duty but to the boy who had called the Kingslayer, the man who shoved Bran out a window, under a whisper of leaves. Gray wind pressed against his thigh and made a sound deep in his chest, like a man trying not to speak. The tent held its breath and then let it out. "Find Karstark," Robb said. And when the man came, his face had already gone that chalk white that looks more like heat than like cold. He had lost 2 sons at the Whispering Wood, and had found a purpose in their loss: guard the man who had killed them. Now the purpose was gone, and only the loss remained, which is a bad solvent for any man. "My king," Rickard Karstark said, and the title had never been spoken more like an accusation, or more like a prayer. "Jaime is escaped," Robb said, "because there are sentences that must be said aloud even if every ear has heard them already. He will run for the east, and then south, and then King's Landing if he has a horse and luck, or for the west," Karstark said, and his voice shook for a heartbeat, and stopped shaking by an act of will that Theon admired against his disgust. "He will not return to his father a prisoner twice. I will have him in my hands. With your leave or without it." "With my leave," Robb said, "but with my word to govern your hands." He paused, because he knew how words can fray. "If you catch him, he lives. He is coin. He is not vengeance. I will not have you make a purse of vengeance. It tears. Nender." Karstark's eyes were the eyes of a man in a snowstorm who cannot find the house he built with his own hands. "Your mother loosed him," he said. "Your mother pulls us all down by the heartstrings she calls love. It is a woman's rope. Men hang on it. Careful," the Blackfish said softly, from a corner of the tent where he had become shadow and suggestion. Karstark did not hear, or did not heed. He turned and went out, the flap banging as if the tent itself had opinions. The next hours had in them 1,000 small quarrels, and one large silence. Robb stood in that silence with his hands rigid at his sides and his jaw set. He did not say of his mother what many men would have, even to himself. He sent riders anyhow. He had to. The war went on, and the war swallowed everything, even the proper seating of anger. Catelyn sat with her hands in her lap and stared at them, and remembered every time those hands had held a child's head to her breast, and every time those hands had pushed a boat with a daughter in it, out into a river because a man had told her that river meant safety for an hour. She did not allow herself the comfort of telling herself she had done right. She had done necessary. It is not the same, and she was honest. Brienne rode with Jaime west, because west was where pride lay and safety did not. They both understood that paradox without speaking it. She kept him in the saddle by force of her will and the strength of her arms when the river mud wanted him. She took his insults and turned them into steps and breath. She held the road for him when the road narrowed to a ribbon and tried to throw him off. He learned, slowly and unwillingly, that a woman could be the reason a man did not die. And he learned it like a man learns that a bone has set crooked but strong. It did not make him kinder. It made him complicated. Rumor of the Kingslayer's absence ran as if the wind had hands. It put iron behind the eyes of men who had lost sons and brothers. It thinned the courtesy in Robb's lines like broth stretched too far. Theon saw the change as he sees a squall. Sea going a shade darker. Gulls spinning without purpose. Men looking at the horizon and not speaking. He did not say aloud what he thought. That this war had always had 2 ropes in it, and that one had just been tugged. In King's Landing, Tyrion read the same letter after it had been carried by 3 ravens in 2 hands in a fear, and found himself smiling without meaning it. "My sweet sister will think the gods have praised her," he said to Varys, who allowed his hands to flutter briefly to show that they were listening. "She will call it destiny. She will call it the reward due her house. She will forget that a missing lion is 1,000 missing mice that run where you do not want them. Then," Varys tilted his head, "you do not think Sir Jaime will come galloping in with the dawn and toss his hair at the gate?" "I think he will come," Tyrion said. "I do not know what dawn he will choose." Meanwhile, Stannis chooses his dawns with that precision men with no sense of humor achieve. "He will stand off the mouth of our river and count to 3. And if my chain is not in place by the time he reaches 2, we will all count to 1. Then thou." He spent the next hours in the bowels of the castle, which was not a metaphor, but a fact. He watched men haul links thicker than a man's thigh. He watched Hallyne's Lackbeard stir his green hell. He watched Bronn insult men until they did things faster than they had thought possible. He wondered how many of the men whose faces he did not know would soon be remembered by their wives, who kept their names written twice on the backs of cupboards where the smoke did not reach. Roose Harrenhal read the news and did not smile and did not sigh. He altered 3 sentences in a letter he was writing to a minor lord, whose lands had been eaten by men with red cloaks, and men with brown and men with no cloaks at all. He added a line, "Hold your men close, do not let them wander in pride." Then he called for Arya, Nan, and told her to remind the cooks that the leeks must be cut long ways for the Lord's pot and crossways for the men's, and to say it exactly so or he would know she had not carried the message. She did as told and thought, while she said it, how many lines were drawn in kitchens. She did not think of Jaime Lannister without thinking of Bran, and every thought of Bran made another small hard thing in her. She told herself quietly 2 names, and fell asleep saying the 3rd, and did not dream. Robb put the news aside because he had to, which is to say he put it into his pockets, and carried it like a weight. He moved men northwest, along the folds that lie like ribs between the Green Fork and the Gold Road, until he came within smelling distance of Ashmark. He did not mean to take Ashmark. Adam Marbrand would have made that a dear price. He meant to run a knife along its ribs and make it raise an arm in reflex. He set the Blackfish on the right, with 300 riders, and Dacey on the left, with 200, and the Grey John in the middle, with an appetite. He walked his horse the last mile and listened. Always listen before the first arrow goes. Sometimes the world tells you it is not ready to be fought, and if you disobey, it punishes you later. The Lannister riders came in 2 files, crisp and neat, because Adam taught his men neatness as if it were a virtue and not a habit. They did not expect the hedge to hold men in it like fish in a weir. The first volley was a polite cough. The second was a statement. The third was a promise. Theon loosed 3 arrows and then slung his bow because the song inside the wood was wrong for him, and took a spear from a man who was no longer using it. He used it with something like joy and something like disgust, and neither feeling canceled the other. It was not a grand fight, and not long. They were the best kind of fights for a commander. Short, controlled, with purpose achieved and men accounted for. Theon took a boy on the ground by his collar and noticed the brocade on the boy's sleeve even as he held him. He thought of Ransom and of the narrow line Robb asked them all to tow. He did not kill him. He dragged him like a sack out of the crush, and found the Great John had done the same with 2, and was laughing as if this were a game in a yard, and not a piece of a war that had its teeth in all their clothes. After the dust settled to the slow applause of leaves, Robb sat his horse and pointed with his chin. "Smoke there," he said. It rose thin and mean. Too little for a house, too much for a cook fire. A straw stack. We will send a man to tell them to put it out, and keep it from lighting again, because we are not their masters, and would not be. But we will remember their name, and we will send them grain from Seagard, if the winter bites. The Grey John made a skeptical noise, and Robb ignored it, because one cannot explain every mercy to a man whose joy is simple and honest and sharp. Back at the sea, Victarion set a plan that smelled of old salt. There was a rocky spit north of the Crakehall fields where boats could thrust their noses in among the teeth and not be seen from the road. The river carts that came from the Mander into the west brought salt fish and barley, and rumor. Asha's men had made friends with a carter whose son had taken a horse's kick and walked with a limp. He wanted coin to buy a better mule. He wanted a story to tell the boy to make him laugh with the coin. He gave them the schedule of a convoy meant for Ashamark. 20 wagons, 40 men on foot, 10 riders who made themselves look like 15 by noise and posture. Victarion grunted. Asha smiled. They put men ashore before the moon rose and lay them in the ditch with docks and burdock, hiding their faces. It rained a little, which made the ditch smell rich, and kept the riders drowsy and their bowstrings slack. The ambush was a harvest, quick and plain. The riders took the first volley in their horses and slid in the mud trying to get out. The footmen raised shields because they had been taught to do so, and then found those shields full of the wrong arrows and heavy. A teamster swore at a mule as if the mule were the god's ear. Asha herself took the lead mule's halter and spoke to it the way she speaks to stubborn men. Lo, a muse promising, until it looked at her out of the side of its eye and decided obedience was a smaller trouble than resistance. They turned the wagons 3 at a time and had them down the lane and gone before Adam's outriders came close enough to see the ruts. Victarion left 2 dead men propped against a tree with coins on their eyes and their hands folded, which was how his mother had put his father down when she had nothing else to offer the sea in exchange. Adam Marbrand rode up with his men in an orderly arc, and took in what could be taken in without calling the gods down to show him the rest. He looked at the ruts. He looked at the ditch. He looked at the tree line. He breathed slowly. He did not pursue vaguely. He took a narrow column and followed one lane to a dead end, then another to a farm and a woman with flour on her arms who knew nothing, and knew it convincingly. He turned his horse and said to his sergeant, "They will go to ground where boats wait, and not where banners fly. Send to Davin. Tell him to keep his men close to his belly, and stop pretending he has a sword for every tree. We will be bitten less if we keep our ankles together." Theon watched those plays from a ridge with a little boy's delight at cleverness and a grown man's respect for what it costs. He saw Asha make a boast to her men at the end of a plank and turn it into a joke that sent each to his tasks with that special ironborn love of audacity. He saw Victarion count and subtract and count again, which is what command is when done without poetry. He saw how quickly a town forgets its fear when bread appears in the morning, even if the cart that brought it had a stolen wheel and a new paint on and all. He carried Robb's next word back like a coin. It was simple and therefore weighty. Cut the golden tooth off without breaking your teeth on it. Theon sat with it in his hands on a coil of rope and thought of stone that had stood 100 years and would stand 100 more, unless struck in a particular place that a mason could show you. He thought of the tooth's pride in itself, and pride has doors a clever thief can use. Asha thought of the river that runs past it, and of the men who sell eels to a garrison, because soldiers grow tired of salted pork. Victarion thought of fire in the right place at the right hour, which makes a lord stare north, and miss the footfalls behind him. Aaron thought of nothing but the god, and said he would drown a man and bring him back with a vision of a golden door opened by a black key. He would then tell them where to put their iron. Theon had seen the drowned brought back. He had not seen the key. He told himself stiffly that he did not need to. In Riverrun's great hall, Caitlin faced the thing she had known would come as surely as rain in autumn. Robb's anger. He did not shout. She had taught him that shouting weakens the argument you most want to win. He did not say that she had broken him. He said only what could be defended in words. That she had loosed their coin into the world at a time when coin bought everything and stolen its guard. That she had weakened his hand with his lords. That she had endangered Sansa and Arya as much as saved them. She took it, as a woman takes winter, with habits and with patience. She did not apologize in words because she had already paid in the only coin she owned, honesty. She said, "I did it, and I would do it again if I were the woman I was then, and I would not do it if I were the woman I am now." And both of them knew all 3 sentences were true, and none sufficient. Karstark walked out of the hall with murder on him like a smell. Men averted their eyes. They did not want to admit they recognized it. Night makes murder braver. By noon the next day, 2 Lannister squires were cold in their straw, and Rickard Karstark's hands were steady. Robb passed the sentence and took the swing and the blade bit bone. Theon watched it with his jaw clenched, not to keep from weeping and not to keep from speaking, but to keep from letting his teeth chatter from the knowledge that this was a boy he had hunted with, and a king he served, and a friend he had trusted, and a friend he had trusted, and a part of the world that had just cut something out of itself and would never grow it back. After, Robb's face looked older in a way that did not attach itself to any particular line or gray hair. He sent the Karstark men away, out of heart and out of hand. A house does not forgive, and the war would find a use for their bitterness without asking anyone's leave. Tyrion's chain sat in the black water like a patient snake. Hallyne stroked his jars as if they were children. Bronn spat over the wall because he disliked the river's smell and everything it remembered. Sansa sat with the embroiders and learned that women have their own languages for fear. Cersei drank and smiled, and put her hand on her belly, and felt the absence there as a presence. Joffrey walked the walls in an armor that made him look like a small boy inside a beetle's shell, and said he would shoot his uncle's head from his shoulders when the battle came. And men agreed because they liked their heads on their shoulders, and Joffrey had a crossbow and the habit of pointing. Stannis stood at Dragonstone under a sky drilled clean by wind, and listened to Davos say quietly, the thing no one else would say, that men fight for love of an idea or of a man, or for fear of losing both, and that the city he meant to take had men inside who knew how to fear. Stannis said, "Good," as if fear were an ally who had kept an appointment and gave the order. His fleet moved under sails the color of seriousness. He wrote a letter to no one in particular that said only, "I will come at dawn." He had never been a man for courtesy beyond the minimum required to convey meaning. Robb learned of Stannis on the river's lip in a tent that smelled like canvas and men's ambition. He read the tidings and folded them, and for a long breath his face showed the boy in the snow with Bran running beside him, and a long day ahead with nothing to do but be alive. Then he let that pass and put his hand to the map, and said, "We pull the west as taut as we can make it without breaking, and we do not send men south. If Stannis takes the city, he takes it. If he burns it, he burns it. He burns in the river, he dies. We are not the trident. We are the neck and the fork. We will be ourselves, and not a southern lord's idea of an ally." Men argued for form's sake, and then fell silent, because they knew there was no road that made both their mothers proud and their fathers easy. Theon sat and watched and thought of Asha under a cliff and Victarion counting boats by touch, and of Aeron's wet breath when he pronounced a blessing. He thought of Winterfell, which he had not thought of in a week, and saw it as a room with a door he could not open, and a girl sitting with her feet tucked under her on a bench. And he swallowed and did not say her name. He went west again, because that was what the rope in him tugged. He found Asha at the mouth of a little river that did not have a name beyond what the local men called it, to distinguish it from the next one. She had 2 ships pulled up on the shingle, and her men drying net and laughter in equal measure. She looked at him and her mouth crooked. "What is it?" she asked. "You have the look of a man who has swallowed a cat and is wondering whether to lie about the fur." "Karstark's boys are dead," Theon said. Robb struck the blow himself. Asha's eyebrows rose. "Good," she said cheerfully. "That will be a story told in halls. It will make men consider before they tell themselves they serve their vengeance, when they serve only their own soft needs. Then, that is not how men here will take it," Theon said. "They will make 2 stories. Of a boy who forgets what fathers feel, and of a king who remembers what kings must do. Both will be true. Both will be used." "Everything is used," Asha said. "That is the lesson of men who go to sea to steal a living. If they do not use you, you use them. If the god uses you, he does not ask permission." "Ben." Victarion came and stood with his hands behind him, the position of a man who ties himself to a mast that is not there. "The golden tooth can be choked from 3 mouths," he said without preamble. "From the river, from the carts, and from the pride of the men in it. We can make them tell themselves they are besieged without a siege." "How?" Theon asked, because Victarion's mind made a kind of sense that pleased him. "Put a fire where the river barges tie at night," Victarion said. Send 3 carts with broken wheels and bent axles to the 2 villages where they hire their carters, and have those wheels break where the road narrows. Take their steward's son and give him back with coin and a tale of mercy, and make the steward thank the men who took him. Then wait. Pride will tell him he controls what he does not. Pride is a worse chain than iron. Pride is a worse chain than iron. Aaron, who had come up from the water carrying his own sea with him in his hair and beard, nodded once, as if the god had co-signed Victarion's thought. Break the rope men cannot see, he said. Leave the iron strong for your own ships. So they did. Small fires in the right places. Small kindnesses more destabilizing than torches. Small insults to dignity more lasting than a blow. The steward's son returned speaking of a woman with a laugh that did not mock him, and a man who counted him alive as a better coin than any purse. The steward's hand shook when he took his boy, and less when he took the tale of mercy, and not at all when he spoke at table 2 nights later about how the lion keeps control better by putting out saucers of milk for mice and letting them feel they sneak. Words like that do a commander's work for him if he is not careful. Adam Marbrand was careful. He moved his lodgings to the barracks and ate bread with the garrison, and never put the steward between himself and any decision thereafter. Theon slept that night under the cliff and dreamed, not of rope and not of fire, but of Winterfell's godswood. The heart tree's face had been cut by a man who had long since become soil, and yet the expression on it had altered in Theon's mind or in the world. It had always been sad to him, and now it seemed only attentive, as if it waited for him to stop lying. He woke with sand in his teeth and the taste of snow in his throat, and said aloud, "Because the sea drowns lies as efficiently as men. I am not a good man. I will be a useful one." The gulls did not contradict him. Stannis came at dawn and found Tyrion's chain where it had promised to be. The wildfire answered as it always answers, like a god men made and feared, and then forgot to feed. The river burned. A horse screamed in a way horses scream when fire takes them. Men scream too, and in more languages. Davos lost sons, and kept his lord, and kept his honesty, and that was all that had ever been asked of him by anyone who understood him. The city shook like a dog ridding itself of fleas and found itself with teeth. Tywin, called back by messengers who had ridden into his camp with lather and no wit left, cut across by night under torchlight with men who could keep their order in the dark, and he and the roses of the Reach came over the river like a story taken out of a chest that no one had believed in and now must. They broke Stannis. They did not kill him. He went away reduced not in will, but in opportunity. It would have to do. Tyrion went to sleep for a day and a half with blood on him that was his, and not, and woke with his face hurting and his sister's words in his ear like salt in a cut. He put a hand to his cheek and found 2 things. That skin heals, and that debts do not. He set his feet on the floor and told himself he would not be surprised by either again. When word of Blackwater Reach came to Fairmarket, Robb read it without triumph and without grief. He read it as a general reads a story whose last chapter he had predicted and cannot now alter. Catelyn read it and closed her eyes and opened them and said, "Sansa remains," and the boy who had been her son and was now her king put his hand over her knuckles briefly, and then moved away to tell men where to shift the horse lines and where to keep the grain from mold. Theon read it alone and found himself feeling something unpleasantly like admiration for Tyrion Lannister, which he remedied by going to Asha and letting her mock it out of him until it became only a professional respect a thief might have for a lock. Tywin, restored to his own stories, sent the West its pride back with interest. Davin came up out of the Ashmark lanes with his beard full of burrs and a laugh, and Adam wrote with less patience and more ink. Forley Prester held what he was told to hold without poetry and without failure. The pressure remained because pressure applied once is not a door, it is a hand. But the West remembered who had built its stone. Robb watched that remembering with a kind of grim serenity. "Good," he said. "Let him stand still for a while. A standing enemy makes men brave. A moving one makes them afraid. I prefer to fight brave men. They are predictable." Bendand. Winter's smell came one morning like breath blown from far off. The dawn had frost on its edges. The grass underfoot caught, and cracked. Men spoke less when the air did that. They kept their breath for their lungs. Theon walked out beyond the last picket into the field behind the orchard, and listened. The land itself made that very faint sound it makes when the sap thinks of retreating. He thought of Winterfell in a way that made his ribs ache, and his hands feel like they belonged to someone who had weathered without him. Robb called him in then, and laid a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Come with me to Seaguard, and on to Pike. We will speak to Balon with one voice and make the next bit of this war a thing that does not grind our men in its teeth, while the lions set the table for a winter's feast. I will ask him for more than raids. I will ask him to carry us when the river's ice. If he will not, I will learn it now, and not in the snow." Catelyn's face changed a fraction. The sea takes men with a suddenness the land rarely does. She said, "Write to me every day you are on it, from every cove and every deck, and I will forgive you for becoming a man I do not wholly recognize." He smiled at her with effort and did not promise. Promises too many are like bread too much leavened, impressive and collapsing. He put his cloak on and said to Theon, "I will need your tongue and your sister's wit and your uncle's certainty and your father's stubbornness. If I cannot have all four, I will take three. If I cannot have three, tell me which two will break least when tied together." Nah. Theon thought of all the knots he had learned as a boy, and all the ones he had invented as a man, and said, because honesty had begun to serve him better than attempt at cleverness, none of those want to be tied. But Asha will always tie herself to a story. Tie her to a good one. Victarion will tie to the sea. Tie him to a tide. Balon ties only to the voice he hears when he looks at the waves. Tie him to the sound of his own name shouted eastward. Aeron ties to the god. We cannot tie gods. We can only say their names with respect. Nenepamni. Robb nodded. Then we will tell Asha a tale of winter and of a boy who learned to swim, he said, and Theon laughed because he could not help it. They rode northwest to Seaguard with 200 picked riders and a string of pack horses that looked thin and indignant. Lord Mallister gave them ships with a solemn care. A man might give a son-in-law his daughter. "This is mine. Treat it as yours. Do not kill it." Theon stepped onto the deck and felt the old tilt under him, the shape of his gait going back into a mold he had never managed to break. Robb stood and did not immediately look green, because he had taught himself to stand on moving things with grace. Horses and rivers had been his tutors. He looked at the horizon with that open attention he sometimes had that made men think him vulnerable, and was only the way he made himself bigger inside. The voyage was short by sea standards and long by stomachs. The wind came slant and kind. Theon stood with his boots set and told himself this was the work that was in front of him, and therefore the work he would love. Robb asked him once quietly what the drowned god took as glittering in exchange for favor. Theon said, "Men," and Robb nodded as if that answer were reasonable and not monstrous. Pike rose out of the fog like the memory in an old man's mind of a cliff he once fell from and survived. Balon stood where he had stood a dozen times in Theon's imagination, only shorter by the measure of time, and more himself by the measure of will. Asha walked out to meet them as if she owned the rope bridges and the wind, and would sell both if the price were amusing. Victarion came and stood with one hand on a post, as if the post were the only thing he allowed to keep him upright. Robb bowed and did not bend his back too deeply and said, "Lord Balon, you have made the West remember salt. I ask you to help me teach them ice." Balon's mouth did a thing that might have been a smile, or the shape of the thought before it became one. "You ask me to be winter's hand," he said. "I am already the seas." "I ask you to be both," Robb said, plain. "Carry grain up the coast to river mouths while the water runs. Carry men when it freezes where other ships cannot. Set me down where lions do not expect me, and pick me up before they have learned to plant their paws in snow. Take my prisoners to Seaguard, and take my boys home in exchange, by ship and not by road, where Tywin cannot touch the exchange. Take letters to White Harbor faster than ravens can fly, and bring back silver and flour. Ask me anything you like in return but my crown and my word." "Bender." Aeron's eyes gleamed. "He speaks like a man who prays without knowing it," he murmured. The god loves men who do not name him and yet do his work. Balin looked from Robb to Theon and back. "And if I take the hand you offer," he said, "and the lion comes with a bigger hand? Then close yours on mine," Robb said. "I am not a fish. I have a grip." Asha laughed aloud. Victarion's mouth did not move, but his eyes warmed a fraction. He liked men who spoke of grips. Aeron lifted his staff and made a sound that might have been piety and might have been the sea under a different roof. The wind gusted, and the bridge ropes thrummed like an instrument. Theon stood half a pace behind Robb and smelled old kelp and old quarrels, and felt something like relief because he was holding both ropes, and neither had cut his palms yet. He looked down and saw the sea and did not want it, and looked up and saw the hall and did not want that either, and looked sideways at Robb and Asha and wanted both of what was promised there, a plan and a story. He told himself there would be time to choose. The lie did not taste as bad as lies usually did. Men moved, as men will when a thing is decided that will keep them from idling themselves into mischief. Balin called for ale and counsel. Aeron called for water and faith. Victarion called for charts. Asha called for a wager. How many days before a lion writes us a letter pretending to be a sheep? Theon called for nothing, and went where he was sent, and said what must be said, and did not say what would have been satisfying. Below, the sea banged itself against rock, and took what was already broken, which is the sea's way. Never a thief of whole things only, always an opportunist at the littlest demonstrations of neglect. The sky went clean after its week of cloud. You could see far, and what you saw was hard and blue. Theon stood in it, and breathed deep and thought. With that sudden, honest clarity that sometimes visits a man uninvited, that whatever came next would be a smaller room than the one he had been in these last weeks, and that he would have to live in it with all the bones he had. He squared his shoulders, the way a boy does when told to bear an armful of wood and not drop it, and the gesture fit him better than it had when he had been that boy, which means a part of him had grown. The plan, when it hardened, looked simple in the way all good plans do when they have been fitted to the hands that will carry them. The Ironborn would run 3 arteries up the coast, one heavy with grain toward the Blue Fork's mouth and the Twins, one light and fast to White Harbor with letters and small goods, one mean with tricks and little fires to the inlets below the Golden Tooth. Robb would sweep the west bank of the Trident with riders and carts, and sow his men where the coast road touched the river, in ways that allowed the Ironborn to drink the river without touching the land. The prisoners taken at Lannisport would be lined up in Seaguard like bolts of wool to be traded, and the trades would go quick and under oath, so that each man returned either bought or refused. There would be no lingering disputes for Tywin to put a finger into and stir. Stories cannot be sent like parcels, Catelyn wrote to her son when he sent her the shape of it. And he smiled at the letter as a man smiles at weather he has been expecting. He wrote back, "I will send you bread instead. Tell me if you find it dull." She read that and set the letter under a stone on her table so that it would not blow off in a draft, and told herself not to love him for that line, because a mother loves her son for such lines, and then the line is all that is left to warm her. She went to her prayers and did not ask the gods for anything particular, because she had learned they prefer to be thanked for general mercies. Tywin, reading his own ravens and counting them against what his outriders saw and what his steward did not, paused over one report with an eyebrow that signaled interest more than surprise. River barges delivering flour at night to a landing below the Twins. Ironborn boats taking on nothing where they should have taken on timber. A steward's son talking sense at a table where 2 months ago pride and wine had slopped together as easy as brothers. He put the paper down and moved the iron lion on the board an inch. "Fair," he said aloud in the tone of a man remarking that a piece of wood has held for another day under a weight that might have broken it. "We will see whose season comes first. Winter for the wolf or weariness for the sea." He sent a dam north in force for a raid not disguised as anything, and watched to see whether the kraken would bite at bait or swim on. He sent Davin to stand in the door at Ashmark as if he were always meant to be there. He sent Forley Prester east again, because Forley was a man who made other men less foolish merely by sharing their space. He wrote a letter to Tyrion in which he did not scold and did not praise, merely enumerated what was necessary, and that letter, when it reached King's Landing, made Tyrion sigh and pour wine and get up anyway to shout at Howline, about the place where the chain had scoured the pilings. At sea, Theon stood shoulder to shoulder with Asha, and looked at Robb's face blown pale by salt, and saw how the boy wore the sea on him, with the same grace he wore a cloak under rain, and a smile under a wound. He felt alarming and undeniable pride. He allowed it. The night came down clear, and the stars were a sieve. The sea poured itself through. The oars counted. The tide told its old story. The war paused for the space of a single watch, held its breath, and did not dare to speak. Then the first gull cried in the morning dark, and men moved again, and the new shape of their coalition, wolf and kraken, tide and frost, went out with them, like a sound that they were only beginning to learn to sing in unison.